Cognitive dissonance is the psychological phenomenon that occurs when a person holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values simultaneously. The resulting mental discomfort becomes so unbearable that the mind will go to extraordinary lengths to resolve the conflict, often abandoning logic entirely. Leon Festinger first identified this mechanism in 1957 after infiltrating a doomsday cult led by Dorothy Martin, who claimed aliens would rescue believers before Earth's destruction on December 21, 1954. When the predicted apocalypse failed to materialize, Festinger observed something remarkable. Instead of abandoning their beliefs, the cult members doubled down, claiming their faith had actually saved the world. The tobacco industry weaponized cognitive dissonance for decades. Philip Morris executives knew their own research proved cigarettes caused cancer, yet they continued smoking while publicly denying the health risks. Internal documents revealed how they deliberately created dissonance in smokers by funding contradictory studies, making it easier for addicted customers to rationalize their habit. Military interrogators exploit this psychological vulnerability through a technique called effort justification. Prisoners who endure harsh treatment often develop positive feelings toward their captors because admitting the suffering was meaningless creates unbearable dissonance. The mind resolves this conflict by convincing itself the captors must be worthy of respect. Modern marketing departments have turned dissonance reduction into a science. Apple customers who spend thousands on devices will aggressively defend the brand against criticism, not because of superior features, but because acknowledging poor value would contradict their self-image as smart consumers. Political operatives understand that voters experiencing dissonance will seek information that confirms their existing beliefs while avoiding contradictory evidence. This selective exposure creates echo chambers where citizens can maintain conflicting views about democracy while supporting authoritarian policies. The most disturbing application involves the Stockholm Syndrome effect, where hostages develop emotional bonds with their captors as a dissonance resolution strategy. Gaslighting is a psychological manipulation technique that makes victims question their own memory, perception, and sanity. The term comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband systematically dims and brightens the gas lights in their home while denying any changes when his wife notices. The process works by gradually introducing doubt into a person's mind through persistent denial, contradiction, and withholding of information. The manipulator will flat out deny events that happened, claim the victim is being too sensitive, or insist they're remembering things wrong. Over time, this creates a psychological dependency, where the victim relies on the gaslighter to define reality for them. What makes gaslighting particularly insidious is its incremental nature. It doesn't happen overnight. The manipulator starts with small contradictions and builds up to larger reality distortions. They might move objects and claim they were never moved, share different versions of conversations, or isolate the victim from people who might confirm their version of events. Real-world applications extend far beyond personal relationships. Political gaslighting involves leaders denying documented statements or events despite video evidence. Corporate gaslighting happens when companies deny obvious product flaws or workplace issues. Even medical gaslighting occurs when healthcare providers dismiss patient symptoms as imaginary or exaggerated. The psychological effects include chronic self-doubt, anxiety, depression, and what researchers call learned helplessness. Victims often develop a condition called gaslighting amnesia, where they genuinely struggle to trust their own memories. Some become so dependent on external validation that they lose the ability to make basic decisions independently. The technique has become so recognized that the American Psychological Association now includes it in discussions of emotional abuse, and several states have begun incorporating psychological manipulation into their legal definitions of domestic violence.
Like this video and subscribe to Maker.
Social proof and conformity pressure is the psychological phenomenon where people adjust their behavior and beliefs to match what they perceive others are doing, even when it contradicts their own judgment or moral compass. The power of this mechanism was brutally demonstrated in Solomon Asch's line experiments during the 1950s. Participants were shown cards with lines of obviously different lengths and asked to identify which matched a reference line. When surrounded by actors who deliberately gave wrong answers, 75% of real participants gave at least one incorrect response they knew was false, simply to avoid standing out from the group. But the truly disturbing applications emerge when this pressure gets weaponized. Marketing teams discovered that phrases like "most popular choice" or "thousands of satisfied customers" could boost sales by 30 to 40%, regardless of product quality. The technique works so reliably that fake review farms now generate billions in revenue annually. Cult recruitment exploits this mechanism through isolation tactics. New members get separated from outside influences while being surrounded by enthusiastic believers. Former Scientology members describe how constant group reinforcement made even the most bizarre beliefs seem reasonable when everyone around them nodded in agreement. Online platforms amplify conformity pressure through algorithmic echo chambers. Users see content that mirrors their existing views, creating artificial consensus. The 2010s saw multiple instances of coordinated disinformation campaigns using bot networks to manufacture false social proof, making fringe ideas appear mainstream. The bystander effect demonstrates conformity pressure's darker side. When Kitty Genovese was attacked in 1964, 38 witnesses reportedly did nothing, each assuming others would intervene. This diffusion of responsibility through group dynamics has since been replicated in countless emergency situations. Even medical professionals fall victim. Studies show doctors are more likely to misdiagnose patients when surrounded by colleagues who express confidence in incorrect assessments, overriding their own clinical judgment to maintain group harmony. Authority bias is the unconscious tendency to assign greater credibility and accuracy to information, simply because it comes from someone perceived as an authority figure. This cognitive shortcut allows people in positions of power to bypass critical thinking and insert ideas directly into our decision-making process. The most disturbing demonstration came from Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 1960s. Ordinary people administered what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to strangers, simply because a researcher in a lab coat told them to continue. 65% of participants went all the way to maximum voltage, despite hearing screams from the other room. The effect works through what researchers call the white coat phenomenon. Medical professionals, scientists, and officials trigger automatic deference responses that evolved to help humans navigate social hierarchies. Our brains essentially switch off skepticism when authority signals are detected. Advertisers exploit this relentlessly. That smiling person in scrubs recommending toothpaste likely has no medical training whatsoever. Cults use fake credentials and manufactured authority to gain initial trust before implementing deeper control techniques. The bias becomes dangerous during crisis situations when people desperately seek guidance. False experts emerge during disasters, pandemics, and social upheaval, knowing that stressed populations will accept authority claims with minimal verification. Modern manipulation has evolved beyond traditional uniforms and titles. Social media influencers manufacture authority through follower counts and verified badges. Corporate executives leverage business success to gain credibility on unrelated topics. The most sophisticated operators layer multiple authority signals simultaneously while maintaining plausible deniability about their true qualifications. Reciprocity principle is one of the most powerful psychological triggers hardwired into human behavior, and it operates far below conscious awareness. This mental mechanism compels people to return favors, even when the initial gesture was completely unsolicited and practically worthless. The principle works because humans evolved in small social groups where mutual cooperation meant survival. When someone does something for us, our brains automatically create a psychological debt that feels uncomfortable until repaid. This discomfort is so strong that people will often return favors that are significantly more valuable than what they originally received. Robert Cialdini documented this extensively in his research during the 1970s and 80s. In one famous experiment, researchers posing as Hare Krishna members gave people small flowers in airports before asking for donations. The success rate skyrocketed compared to simply asking for money directly. People who had no interest in the religious movement still felt compelled to give money because of a flower worth mere pennies. The door-in-the-face technique exploits reciprocity by making an unreasonably large request first, then following up with the real target request. When the person refuses the large request, they feel obligated to comply with the smaller one because the requester has seemingly compromised. Sales professionals use reciprocity by offering free samples, consultations, or small gifts before making their pitch. The pharmaceutical industry mastered this by providing free lunches, pens, and conference trips to doctors, knowing these seemingly innocent gestures would unconsciously influence prescribing habits. Political campaigns deploy reciprocity through town halls and meet and greets where candidates personally thank supporters, creating individual psychological debts that translate into votes and volunteer hours. The technique becomes particularly insidious when combined with time pressure and social proof, creating a psychological perfect storm that bypasses rational decision-making entirely. Anchoring bias is a psychological manipulation technique that hijacks your decision-making process before you even realize what's happening. Your brain latches onto the very first number or piece of information it encounters, then uses that as a reference point for everything that follows. The effect was first documented by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the 1970s through a series of unsettling experiments. In one study, they had participants spin a rigged wheel of fortune that would land on either 10 or 65. Afterwards, they asked people to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Those who saw 10 on the wheel guessed around 25%. Those who saw 65 guessed around 45%. A completely random number on a spinning wheel had manipulated their estimates by 20 percentage points. Real estate agents have weaponized this for decades. The listing price becomes an anchor that warps every buyer's perception of value, even when that price is completely arbitrary. Car salespeople do the same thing by showing you the most expensive model first, making everything else seem reasonable by comparison. Online retailers exploit anchoring by showing inflated original prices next to sale prices. That crossed out $99 amount makes the $49 sale price feel like a steal, even if the item was never actually sold for $99. Political strategists use anchoring in debates and negotiations. By opening with an extreme position, they make their actual goal seem moderate and acceptable. The initial outrageous demand becomes the anchor that shifts the entire discussion in their favor. The most disturbing aspect of anchoring bias is how it operates completely below conscious awareness. Even when people are explicitly warned about the effect and told to ignore the anchor, they still fall victim to it. Your rational mind thinks it's making independent judgments, but it's actually being steered by that first piece of information, like a puppet on strings. Foot-in-the-door technique is a psychological manipulation method that turns your natural desire to be consistent against you. The technique works by first securing agreement to a small, harmless request, then escalating to increasingly larger demands. The method exploits a fundamental quirk in human psychology discovered by researchers Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser in 1966. They found that homeowners who agreed to place a small 3-inch sign supporting safe driving in their window were later 76% more likely to agree to install a massive, ugly billboard in their front yard promoting the same cause. The technique operates on self-perception theory. Once you comply with the initial request, your brain labels you as the type of person who supports this cause, or someone who helps others. When the larger request arrives, refusing would create uncomfortable cognitive dissonance so most people simply comply to maintain their newfound identity. Door-to-door salespeople have weaponized this for decades. They might start by asking if you care about home security, then whether you'd like a free estimate, then if you'd sign up for a demonstration. Before you know it, you're signing a $2,000 contract because backing out would mean admitting you don't actually care about protecting your family. Political campaigns use this ruthlessly during election seasons. Volunteers first ask if you support clean water, then request you sign a petition, then ask for a small donation, then volunteer time, then larger donations. Each yes makes the next yes easier. The technique becomes particularly sinister in recruitment scenarios. Cult leaders and extremist groups begin with seemingly innocent requests for attendance at social events or reading materials, gradually escalating to demands for isolation from family, financial contributions, and complete lifestyle changes. What makes this technique so effective is that victims genuinely believe they're making independent choices at each step, never recognizing the psychological trap closing around them. Confirmation bias is the psychological mechanism that transforms rational humans into selective information processors, unconsciously filtering reality to match their existing beliefs. This mental shortcut operates like a cognitive spotlight, illuminating evidence that supports what someone already thinks while casting contradictory information into shadow. The human brain literally rewires itself to seek out confirming data, creating neural pathways that strengthen with each validation. Social media platforms weaponize this tendency through algorithmic feeds designed to show users content that reinforces their worldview. Facebook's internal documents revealed that their engagement algorithms specifically amplify divisive content because it generates more clicks and longer session times. Users become trapped in what researcher Eli Pariser called filter bubbles, where dissenting viewpoints simply vanish from their digital landscape. The Salem witch trials of 1692 demonstrate confirmation bias in its most extreme form. Once townspeople accepted the premise that witches lived among them, every unusual event became evidence of supernatural interference. A cow dying, milk souring, or children having nightmares all confirmed the witch hypothesis, rather than suggesting natural explanations. Modern cult recruitment exploits this bias systematically. Certain groups use a technique called thought stopping, where members were trained to dismiss outside criticism as attacks from jealous outsiders. Each piece of negative information about the organization became proof of how special and misunderstood the group was. Peter Wason's experiments in the 1960s revealed how deeply embedded this bias runs. Participants given the number sequence 2, 4, 6 consistently tested hypotheses that confirmed their initial guess about the pattern rather than trying to disprove it. Most assumed the rule was consecutive even numbers, when the actual rule was simply ascending numbers. The backfire effect takes confirmation bias to its logical extreme. When people encounter information that contradicts their strongly held beliefs, they often emerge believing their original position even more firmly than before. Loss aversion psychology is the mental phenomenon where losing something hurts approximately twice as much as gaining that same thing feels good. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky discovered this cognitive bias in the 1970s, and it fundamentally changed how we understand human decision-making. The mathematics behind loss aversion reveals something unsettling about our brains. When people lose $20, the emotional pain registers at roughly the same intensity as the pleasure they'd feel from finding $40. This 2-to-1 ratio isn't just a quirk of human nature. It's an exploitable weakness that corporations, governments, and manipulators have weaponized for decades. Retailers use loss aversion to trap customers in purchasing decisions. Those limited time offers and countdown timers on websites aren't just creating urgency. They're triggering your brain's fear of missing out on something you never actually owned. The mere suggestion that you might lose access to a deal activates the same neural pathways as if you were already losing money from your wallet. Political campaigns exploit loss aversion by framing their opponents' policies as threats to what voters currently have. Instead of promising new benefits, Successful candidates often focus on what their opponent will take away from you: your health care, your job security, your way of life. The fear of loss motivates voters more powerfully than the promise of gain. Casino designers understand loss aversion intimately. Slot machines are programmed to deliver frequent small wins early in a session, creating the illusion of ownership over those temporary gains. When the inevitable losses begin, players experience them as money being taken away rather than bets that simply didn't pay off. This psychological shift keeps people feeding coins into machines long past the point of rational decision-making. The endowment effect amplifies loss aversion even further. Simply touching or briefly owning an item increases its perceived value in your mind. Car dealerships offer test drives knowing that once you've sat behind the wheel, your brain begins treating the vehicle as a possession you're about to lose rather than a purchase you're considering. Loss aversion shapes everything from why people refuse to sell stocks at a loss to why subscription services make cancellation processes deliberately complicated. The psychology transforms rational economic actors into predictably irrational decision makers, vulnerable to anyone who understands which emotional buttons to press. Scarcity psychology is the manipulation of human behavior through the illusion that resources, opportunities, or time are running out. This technique exploits a fundamental survival instinct that developed when our ancestors actually faced life-threatening shortages. The mechanism works by triggering what researchers call loss aversion, the brain's tendency to fear losing something more than it values gaining the same thing. When people believe something is scarce, their rational decision-making shuts down and gets replaced by panic-driven impulses. Marketing departments discovered they could manufacture this panic artificially. Limited time offers, countdown timers, and phrases like "only 3 left in stock" became billion-dollar psychological weapons. The technique works so reliably that companies create fake scarcity even when they have unlimited inventory sitting in warehouses. Robert Cialdini documented how car dealerships would tell customers that a particular deal was only available today, then mysteriously extend the same offer when buyers return the next week. The false deadline created enough urgency to close sales that might have otherwise fallen through. Airlines perfected this manipulation by showing messages like, "Only 2 seats left at this price," even when dozens of identical seats remained available. The artificial pressure pushes travelers to book immediately, rather than shop around or wait for better deals. Political campaigns weaponize scarcity psychology during election cycles. Fundraising emails flood inboxes with messages about crucial deadlines and disappearing matching donations. The constant manufactured urgency keeps supporters in a state of perpetual crisis, opening their wallets repeatedly. Social media platforms use scarcity to drive engagement through disappearing content and limited-time features. Snapchat built its entire early success on messages that vanished after viewing, making every interaction feel precious and irreplaceable. The psychological impact extends beyond simple purchasing decisions. Scarcity conditioning creates chronic anxiety as people become trained to act immediately whenever they encounter any limitation. This learned behavior makes populations more susceptible to authoritarian messaging about threats that require immediate, unquestioned responses. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological phenomenon where hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors, even defending them against authorities attempting rescue. The term originated from a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, where 4 employees were held hostage for 6 days in a bank vault. When police finally freed them, the hostages refused to testify against their captors and actually raised money for their legal defense. One hostage later became engaged to one of the robbers. Psychiatrist Niels Bayero coined the term after observing this bizarre loyalty shift. The psychological mechanism involves 3 key conditions: a perceived threat to survival, small kindnesses from the captor, and isolation from other perspectives. The victim's mind essentially rewires itself as a survival strategy, interpreting the captor's decision not to harm them as an act of kindness rather than basic human decency. The syndrome extends far beyond bank robberies. Researchers have documented similar patterns in domestic abuse situations, cult memberships, and even some workplace environments. The case of Patty Hearst in 1974 brought widespread attention when the kidnapped heiress joined her captors in robbing banks, though her lawyers unsuccessfully argued Stockholm Syndrome as a defense. More controversial applications include discussions of entire populations developing affection for oppressive regimes. Some psychologists argue this explains why victims sometimes return to abusive relationships, or why cult members defend their leaders even after escaping. The syndrome challenges our understanding of rational behavior under extreme stress. What appears irrational from the outside becomes a calculated survival mechanism when viewed through the victim's perspective. The human mind's capacity to adapt to threatening situations can produce outcomes that seem to defy logic, making Stockholm Syndrome one of psychology's most paradoxical defense mechanisms. Learned helplessness is a psychological phenomenon where individuals become so conditioned to powerlessness that they stop attempting to escape harmful situations, even when escape becomes entirely possible. Martin Seligman discovered this concept in 1967 through experiments that would be considered ethically questionable today. He placed dogs in cages where they received electric shocks with no way to escape. After repeated exposure, something remarkable happened. When Seligman later moved these same dogs to cages where they could easily jump over a low barrier to safety, most of them simply lay down and accepted the shocks. The dogs had learned that resistance was futile. This discovery sent shockwaves through psychology because it revealed how powerlessness could be taught. The animals weren't physically incapable of escaping. They had been psychologically conditioned to believe escape was impossible. Seligman found that roughly 2/3 of dogs developed this learned helplessness, while 1/3 continued attempting to escape regardless of previous conditioning. This ratio appears consistent across species, including humans. Pluralistic ignorance is a psychological trap where everyone thinks they're the only one having certain thoughts or feelings, when actually most people are experiencing the exact same thing. This mental blind spot creates a perfect storm for mass manipulation. Picture a room full of people who all privately disagree with what's happening, but each person assumes everyone else supports it, so they stay silent and go along with the crowd. The mechanism works through a simple but devastating feedback loop. People observe others' public behavior and assume it reflects their private beliefs. Meanwhile, those same people are hiding their own true thoughts to fit in with what they think is normal. The result is a collective delusion where the perceived majority opinion doesn't actually exist. College researchers Floyd Allport and Daniel Katz first documented this phenomenon in the 1930s, but its applications for social control run much deeper. During the 2010s, tech companies discovered they could weaponize pluralistic ignorance through algorithmic amplification. By showing users carefully curated content that suggested certain viewpoints were more popular than they actually were, platforms could shift entire populations' behavior without anyone realizing they were being influenced. The most chilling example involves what researchers call spiral of silence scenarios. When people believe they hold minority opinions, they become less likely to speak up, which makes their viewpoint appear even less popular, creating a downward spiral of self-censorship. Corporate trainers and political operatives now deliberately engineer situations where pluralistic ignorance takes hold, allowing small groups to control much larger populations, simply by manipulating what people think everyone else believes. Door-in-the-face technique is a psychological manipulation method that exploits human guilt and the need to appear reasonable. The strategy involves making an outrageous request that you know will be rejected, then immediately following up with a smaller request that was your real objective all along. Robert Cialdini first documented this technique in the 1970s through a series of experiments that revealed just how predictable human compliance can be. In his most famous study, researchers approached college students and asked them to volunteer as unpaid counselors at a juvenile detention center for 2 hours every week for 2 years. Predictably, everyone said no. But then came the real request. The same researchers immediately asked these students if they would be willing to take juvenile delinquents on a single 2-hour trip to the zoo. Suddenly, 50% agreed to help. When researchers approached a different group and only asked about the zoo trip without the extreme first request, only 17% volunteered. The technique works because the human brain processes the second request as a concession from the person asking. When someone appears to compromise, we feel socially obligated to reciprocate by compromising ourselves. The dramatic contrast between the requests makes the second option seem entirely reasonable by comparison. Sales professionals discovered they could triple their success rates using this method. Car dealerships became notorious for showing customers the most expensive models first, then guiding them toward the moderately priced vehicles they actually intended to sell. Political fundraisers found similar success. Campaign workers learned to ask potential donors for contributions of $500 before settling for their actual target of $50. The technique proved so effective that it became standard practice across multiple industries. The darker applications emerge in high-pressure situations where people have limited time to think critically about what they're agreeing to. Availability heuristic manipulation is the deliberate exploitation of how our brains judge probability based on what we can easily remember. Your mind naturally assumes that if you can quickly recall examples of something, it must happen frequently. This cognitive shortcut becomes a weapon when manipulators flood your memory with specific images and stories. The technique works by saturating media channels with vivid, emotionally charged examples of rare events while downplaying common, but less dramatic occurrences. When people are asked to estimate risk, they unconsciously rely on whatever springs to mind first. Media organizations discovered this psychological loophole decades ago. Plane crashes receive wall-to-wall coverage for days, creating the illusion that air travel is dangerous despite being statistically safer than driving to the airport. Meanwhile, the 15,000 annual bathtub deaths barely register in public consciousness because they lack visual drama. Political strategists weaponized this during the 2010s by amplifying isolated incidents into perceived epidemics. A single controversial police encounter would be replayed thousands of times across social platforms, making viewers believe such events were far more common than data suggested. The repetition literally rewires risk assessment. Corporations use availability manipulation to sell insurance policies and security systems. Home invasion commercials always air during evening news broadcasts when viewers are already primed with crime stories. The insurance industry pays millions to ensure their nightmare scenarios feel more probable than pleasant outcomes. The manipulation extends beyond traditional media into algorithmic content curation. Social platforms deliberately serve users content that confirms their existing fears, creating echo chambers where unusual threats feel omnipresent. One terrorist attack generates more anxiety than 1,000 successful flights, because dramatic footage loops endlessly while routine safety gets zero screen time. Researchers found that people consistently overestimate the likelihood of shark attacks, kidnappings, and lottery wins while underestimating heart disease, diabetes, and car accidents. The difference lies entirely in media coverage patterns and memorable imagery. Fear appeals in propaganda is a psychological manipulation technique that weaponizes our most primal emotion to bypass rational thinking and drive immediate action. The method operates on a simple but devastatingly effective formula. First, present a terrifying threat that feels both imminent and personal. Second, offer a specific solution that requires immediate compliance. Third, emphasize that delay equals catastrophe. What makes fear appeals particularly insidious is how they hijack the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, causing it to flood the body with stress hormones that shut down critical thinking. When people are scared, they stop analyzing evidence and start seeking the fastest path to safety, even if that path leads them straight into manipulation. Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, perfected this technique in the 1920s when he convinced American women that smoking cigarettes represented freedom and rebellion. But his real masterpiece came during World War II. when he helped craft propaganda that painted enemy nations as existential threats to the American way of life. The most chilling modern example emerged during the 2010s with targeted social media campaigns. Cambridge Analytica demonstrated how psychological profiling could deliver personalized fear messages to millions of users simultaneously. They identified each person's specific anxieties, whether about economic security, cultural change, or physical safety, then crafted messages that made those fears feel urgent and actionable. Fear appeals work because they exploit what psychologists call the availability heuristic. When people can easily imagine a threat, they overestimate its probability. This is why airplane crashes feel more dangerous than car accidents, despite statistics proving the opposite. Propagandists deliberately feed vivid, memorable images of disaster to make abstract risks feel concrete and immediate. The technique becomes truly dark when combined with solution aversion. By presenting problems as so overwhelming that only extreme measures can solve them, fear appeals can make people accept previously unthinkable policies or behaviors. History shows us that populations will surrender remarkable freedoms when convinced that danger lurks around every corner. Parasocial relationship exploitation is the deliberate manipulation of one-sided emotional bonds that viewers form with media personalities, streamers, and online creators. These relationships feel real to the audience member, even though the media figure has no knowledge of their individual existence. The psychology behind this runs deeper than simple celebrity worship. Parasocial relationships trigger the same neurological pathways as genuine friendships. When someone watches their favorite streamer for hundreds of hours, their brain processes this person as part of their social circle. The streamer becomes a trusted friend who just happens to live inside a screen. Smart content creators have weaponized this biological quirk into highly profitable business models. They use carefully crafted intimacy techniques like addressing the camera as if speaking to one person, sharing personal struggles, and creating inside jokes that make viewers feel special and included. Twitch streamers perfected the girlfriend experience long before OnlyFans existed. They would read donation messages aloud, creating a dopamine hit when lonely viewers heard their username spoken by someone they admired. Some streamers deliberately cultivate romantic undertones, using pet names for their audience and responding to donations with exaggerated gratitude that mimics romantic affection. The exploitation becomes more sophisticated with platforms that offer direct messaging features. Creators on sites like OnlyFans employ teams of chatters who impersonate them, building deep emotional connections with subscribers who believe they're talking directly to their favorite performer. These ghostwriters study psychology techniques to maximize emotional investment and spending. Gaming companies have noticed this phenomenon and built entire monetization strategies around it. Mobile games now feature characters who send players personalized messages, remember previous conversations, and express disappointment when players don't log in regularly. The characters are designed to feel like friends who genuinely miss the player's presence. Some creators deliberately target vulnerable demographics like elderly people struggling with loneliness or young adults with social anxiety. They create content that feels like genuine friendship while slowly introducing paid tier systems that promise even more personal connection. The most concerning cases involve creators who build cults of personality around their parasocial relationships. They convince followers that supporting them financially is a moral imperative, often framing critics as enemies trying to destroy their special community. Dr. Alice Marwick's research at the University of North Carolina revealed how influencers manufacture authenticity through strategic vulnerability, sharing just enough personal information to feel genuine, while maintaining careful boundaries that protect their actual privacy. The business model works because parasocial relationships create a sense of reciprocal obligation. Viewers feel indebted to creators who have provided them with companionship and entertainment, even though the relationship exists entirely in their own minds. Social media dopamine loops is the deliberate engineering of addictive feedback systems that hijack your brain's reward pathways every time you open an app. Tech companies discovered they could trigger the same neurochemical response that gambling addicts experience by carefully timing when and how they deliver likes, comments, and notifications. The system works through variable ratio reinforcement schedules, where rewards arrive unpredictably. Your brain releases dopamine not when you receive the notification, but in anticipation of it. This creates a cycle where users compulsively check their phones an average of 96 times per day, desperately chasing that next hit of social validation. Former Facebook executive Sean Parker openly admitted the platform was designed to exploit a vulnerability in human psychology. The notification systems, infinite scroll features, and pull-to-refresh mechanics all mirror slot machine design principles. Tech insiders call it the attention economy, but what they're really trading in is human consciousness itself. Companies like Facebook and Instagram employ teams of neuroscientists and behavioral economists specifically to maximize what they call engagement metrics. These metrics translate directly into advertising revenue, meaning your addiction literally generates profit. The average user now spends over 2 hours daily scrolling through feeds, often without conscious awareness of the time passing. The most insidious aspect involves intermittent variable rewards. Sometimes your post gets 5 likes, sometimes 50, sometimes none at all. This unpredictability keeps users trapped in what researchers term the dopamine deficit state, constantly seeking the next social media high while feeling increasingly empty between sessions. Even the red notification badges are psychologically weaponized. The color red triggers urgency responses in the human brain, making it nearly impossible to ignore. Some former Silicon Valley engineers now advocate for legislation treating social media platforms like tobacco companies, complete with addiction warnings and usage restrictions. Behavioral addiction by design is the deliberate engineering of digital products to create compulsive usage patterns that mirror substance dependencies. Tech companies employ teams of neuroscientists, behavioral economists, and former casino designers to craft experiences that hijack the brain's reward systems. The foundation lies in variable ratio reinforcement schedules, the same mechanism that makes slot machines so effective. Social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram deliver likes, comments, and notifications at unpredictable intervals, triggering dopamine releases that keep users constantly checking their devices. Tristan Harris, a former Google design ethicist, revealed how Silicon Valley companies study addiction research to maximize what they call time on device. His team discovered that the average person checks their phone 150 times per day, with each interaction lasting just seconds, but creating a persistent state of partial attention. Sean Parker, Facebook's founding president, admitted the platform was built to exploit a vulnerability in human psychology by creating short-term, dopamine-driven feedback loops. The company's own internal research showed that passive consumption of social media content correlates with decreased well-being, yet they continued optimizing for engagement over user health. Gaming companies have perfected what psychologist B.F. Skinner called intermittent reinforcement through loot boxes and gacha mechanics. These systems use the same psychological principles as gambling, with companies like Electronic Arts generating over $4 billion annually from these features alone. The persuasive technology field, pioneered by Stanford's B.J. Fogg, teaches designers to create behavior chains, where small actions lead to larger commitments. Dating apps like Tinder use this through infinite scroll mechanisms and artificial scarcity, showing users potential matches just often enough to maintain hope while creating anxiety about missing connections. YouTube's recommendation algorithm, designed by engineers from Netflix's addiction research team, optimizes for watch time above all else. Internal documents leaked in 2018 revealed the platform deliberately promoted increasingly extreme content because it generated longer viewing sessions, regardless of the psychological impact on users. The business model depends on what technology critic Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, where human attention becomes the raw material for behavioral prediction products sold to advertisers. Users aren't customers in this system. They're the product being optimized for maximum extraction value. Trauma bonding is a psychological phenomenon where victims develop strong emotional attachments to their abusers through cycles of punishment and reward. This counterintuitive response explains why people often defend those who harm them most. The mechanism operates on intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful psychological conditioning tools. Abusers alternate between periods of cruelty and unexpected kindness, creating an addiction-like dependency in their victims. The unpredictable nature of when affection might appear keeps victims constantly hoping for the next positive moment. Stockholm Syndrome, first documented after a 1973 bank robbery in Sweden, demonstrates trauma bonding in extreme circumstances. Hostages defended their captors even after rescue, with one victim later becoming engaged to her captor. Patty Hearst's transformation from kidnapping victim to bank robber alongside her captors remains one of the most documented cases. The cycle typically follows 4 stages: tension building, acute abuse, reconciliation with apologies or gifts, and a calm period before the pattern repeats. Each reconciliation phase releases dopamine and oxytocin, the same chemicals involved in romantic love and drug addiction. Cult leaders weaponize trauma bonding through love, bombing followed by isolation and punishment. Jim Jones used this technique extensively at Jonestown, alternating between declaring followers his beloved children and subjecting them to public humiliation and physical punishment. Research by Dr. Donald Dutton in the 1990s revealed that trauma bonding occurs most strongly when abuse is unpredictable and intermixed with positive experiences. The victim's nervous system becomes conditioned to associate relief from terror with the presence of the abuser. Modern applications extend beyond obvious abuse scenarios. Some military training, certain therapeutic practices, and even some workplace dynamics can inadvertently create trauma bonds through power imbalances and intermittent positive reinforcement. Moral licensing is a psychological loophole that allows people to act against their stated values by cashing in on their past good behavior. This mental accounting trick convinces individuals that previous moral actions have earned them credits to spend on future questionable choices. The mechanism operates like a moral bank account. When someone donates to charity, expresses tolerant views, or performs helpful acts, their brain essentially deposits moral currency. Later, when faced with ethically dubious decisions, they unconsciously withdraw from this account to justify their actions. Yale psychologist Benoit Monin discovered this effect in the early 2000s through a series of striking experiments. In one study, participants who had just demonstrated their lack of prejudice by disagreeing with blatantly sexist statements were significantly more likely to favor male candidates over equally qualified female candidates for a stereotypically masculine job. The effect appears across domains with unsettling consistency. Consumer research from MIT revealed that people who purchased eco-friendly products were more prone to lying and stealing in subsequent tasks compared to those who bought conventional items. The green purchase seemed to grant permission for moral shortcuts elsewhere. Politicians weaponize this phenomenon routinely. They highlight past charitable work or progressive stances to deflect criticism of current controversial policies. Corporate leaders invoke their company's previous social responsibility initiatives when defending profit-driven decisions that harm communities or workers. The licensing effect explains why some of the most vocal advocates for moral causes sometimes engage in behavior that directly contradicts their public positions. Their brains treat past advocacy as prepayment for present transgressions. Marketing departments exploit moral licensing by encouraging small ethical purchases that prime customers for larger, less conscientious spending. Environmental campaigns sometimes backfire when people interpret minor conservation efforts as justification for major wasteful behaviors. The phenomenon reveals an uncomfortable truth about human psychology. Moral behavior often serves as a tool for future moral flexibility, rather than a commitment to consistent ethical standards. False memory implantation is the process of deliberately creating vivid, detailed memories of events that never actually occurred. Unlike simple suggestion or wishful thinking, these implanted memories feel completely real to the person experiencing them. complete with sensory details and emotional responses. Elizabeth Loftus pioneered much of this research in the 1970s, discovering that human memory operates more like a Wikipedia page than a video recording. Each time we recall something, we essentially rewrite it, making memory surprisingly vulnerable to outside influence. Her most famous experiment involved showing participants footage of car accidents, then asking about the speed when vehicles smashed versus contacted each other. The single word change didn't just affect speed estimates. A week later, participants who heard smashed were twice as likely to report seeing broken glass that was never there. The Lost in the Mall study took this further. Researchers convinced 25% of participants they had been lost in a shopping mall as children by having family members provide 3 real childhood memories plus 1 fabricated story. Participants not only accepted the false memory, but began adding their own details about being scared and eventually found by an elderly person. Clinical applications revealed even darker possibilities. Some therapists in the 1980s and 90s used recovered memory techniques, convincing patients they had repressed traumatic experiences. These methods, including guided imagery and dream interpretation, led to thousands of false accusations and destroyed families before the psychological community recognized the danger. The implications extend beyond therapy. Eyewitness testimony, once considered the gold standard of evidence, crumbles under this research. Loftus demonstrated that witnesses could be convinced they saw a yield sign instead of a stop sign, or that a clean-shaven perpetrator had a mustache. Modern interrogation techniques exploit these same vulnerabilities, using repeated questioning and suggestion to create false confessions. The Reid technique, still widely used in law enforcement, can inadvertently implant memories of crimes that never happened. What makes false memory implantation particularly unsettling is how effortless it appears. Simply exposing someone to misinformation after an event can permanently alter their recollection. Social media has amplified this effect, as false stories shared repeatedly can become accepted as personal experience. The technique works best with plausible scenarios involving familiar people and places. Researchers have successfully implanted memories of spilling punch at weddings, being attacked by animals, and witnessing supernatural events. The more emotionally charged the false memory, the more resistant it becomes to correction. Conditioning via media is the systematic use of television, films, music, and digital platforms to shape public behavior and thought patterns through repeated exposure to specific messages and imagery. Unlike obvious propaganda, this operates through subtle repetition and emotional association. Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, pioneered many of these techniques in the 1920s, calling it the engineering of consent. His work influenced everything from cigarette marketing to political campaigns. The mechanics rely on classical conditioning principles. News outlets repeat certain phrases until they become automatic associations in viewers' minds. Product placements in movies create subconscious brand preferences. Even background music in commercials triggers specific emotional responses that bypass rational thinking. Television programming schedules exploit circadian rhythms and attention cycles. Primetime slots target when people's critical thinking is naturally lower. Reality shows normalize specific behaviors and social hierarchies by presenting them as entertainment rather than instruction. Social media algorithms amplify this conditioning by creating echo chambers. The platforms track micro-expressions through front-facing cameras and adjust content accordingly. Users receive dopamine hits from likes and shares, creating addictive behavioral loops that make them more susceptible to embedded messaging. Gaming companies employ variable reward schedules borrowed from casino psychology. Players develop emotional attachments to virtual achievements that translate into real-world purchasing decisions. The average person encounters over 3,000 advertising messages daily, most processed subconsciously. Music carries particularly powerful conditioning effects through rhythm and repetition. Certain frequencies can induce anxiety or euphoria. Radio stations coordinate playlists to maintain specific emotional states in listeners throughout their commutes. The most effective conditioning appears invisible to its targets. When done correctly, people believe their preferences and opinions developed naturally rather than through careful manipulation. Groupthink in cults is the psychological phenomenon where group members suppress dissent and critical thinking to maintain harmony. But cults weaponize this natural tendency into something far more dangerous. Unlike regular groupthink in boardrooms or committees, cult groupthink operates under extreme conditions of isolation, sleep deprivation, and information control. Members become so invested in group consensus that they'll ignore obvious red flags about their leader's behavior or the group's direction. The Jonestown Massacre in 1978 demonstrates this perfectly. Jim Jones had conditioned his followers through years of loyalty tests and public criticism sessions. When dissenting voices emerged, other members would immediately shut them down, not because Jones ordered it, but because questioning the group felt like betraying their entire identity. Cults amplify groupthink through a technique called thought stopping. Members learn to interrupt their own critical thoughts with chanting, meditation, or repetitive activities. The Branch Davidians under David Koresh spent hours in Bible study sessions where questioning interpretations was seen as spiritual weakness. The really unsettling part is how members police themselves. Former Scientologists describe a culture where reporting someone's doubts to leadership was considered helping them. This creates a surveillance state where everyone monitors everyone else's commitment levels. Psychologist Irving Janis identified 8 symptoms of groupthink, but cults display all of them simultaneously. They develop illusions of unanimity, where silence equals agreement. They create stereotypes of outsiders as evil or ignorant. Most importantly, they establish mind guards who protect the group from contradictory information. The Heaven's Gate cult took this to extremes by living in complete isolation and consuming only approved media. When members did encounter outside perspectives, they'd been so conditioned to see external criticism as persecution that it actually strengthened their group solidarity. Milgram Obedience Experiments is a series of psychological studies that revealed just how far ordinary people will go when an authority figure gives them orders. Stanley Milgram conducted these experiments at Yale University in the early 1960s, and the results sent shockwaves through the scientific community that are still felt today. Participants believed they were taking part in a learning and memory study. They were assigned the role of teacher, while a Confederate actor played the learner. The teacher sat in front of an imposing shock generator with switches labeled from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts, with ominous warnings like danger, severe shock at the higher levels. Every time the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher was instructed to deliver an electric shock and increase the voltage. Of course, no real shocks were being delivered, but the teachers didn't know this. The learner would cry out in pain, beg to be released, and eventually fall silent, suggesting they had lost consciousness or worse. The truly disturbing part was how the experimenter responded when teachers hesitated. Using just 4 simple prompts like, "Please continue," and "You have no other choice, you must go on," the authority figure pushed participants to keep going. 65% of participants delivered the maximum 450-volt shock, despite believing they might be seriously harming or even killing another human being. These weren't sadistic individuals. They were ordinary people from New Haven, Connecticut, who showed visible signs of stress and moral conflict throughout the experiment. Milgram designed these studies in response to the Nazi war crimes trials, where defendants claimed they were just following orders. He wanted to understand how regular citizens could participate in atrocities under authoritarian regimes. The experiments revealed that physical distance from the victim increased compliance, while proximity to authority figures also boosted obedience rates. When the experimenter left the room and gave instructions by telephone, compliance dropped significantly. Stanford Prison Experiment Dynamics is a psychological phenomenon that reveals how ordinary people can transform into cruel authority figures or submissive victims within just days of being placed in institutional roles. In 1971, Stanford University psychologist Philip Zimbardo converted the basement of the psychology building into a mock prison. He recruited 24 college students through newspaper ads, paying them $15 per day to participate in what they thought would be a simple 2-week study on prison life. Students were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners. The guards received no specific training beyond being told to maintain order. Prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police officers, blindfolded, and brought to the fake prison where they were stripped, deloused, and given identification numbers instead of names. What happened next shocked even Zimbardo himself. Within hours, the student guards began displaying genuine sadistic behavior. They forced prisoners to do push-ups, clean toilets with their bare hands, and perform humiliating tasks for their own entertainment. Some guards worked extra shifts without pay just to continue tormenting the prisoners. The prisoners, meanwhile, became increasingly passive and depressed. Several experienced emotional breakdowns so severe they had to be released early. One prisoner developed a psychosomatic rash from stress. Another went on a hunger strike that the guards punished by placing him in solitary confinement. Perhaps most disturbing was Zimbardo's own transformation. As the prison superintendent, he became so absorbed in his role that when his graduate student girlfriend urged him to stop the experiment due to ethical concerns, his first reaction was anger at her interference with his prison operations. The study was terminated after only 6 days instead of the planned 14, when Zimbardo finally recognized the ethical nightmare he had created. The experiment demonstrated several key psychological mechanisms. Role conformity showed how people adopt behaviors expected of their assigned positions. De-individuation explained how uniforms and anonymity reduced individual moral responsibility. The power of institutional authority revealed how hierarchical structures can corrupt both those who wield power and those subjected to it. Critics later pointed out significant flaws in Zimbardo's methodology, including his active coaching of guards to be more aggressive and his dual role as both researcher and prison superintendent. Some argued the results were more about demand characteristics than genuine psychological transformation. Despite these controversies, the experiment's core insights about institutional power dynamics have been used to understand real-world abuses at places like Abu Ghraib prison and various military installations. Ash conformity under pressure is a psychological phenomenon that demonstrates how easily people abandon their own senses when faced with group pressure. Solomon Asch discovered this disturbing reality in his experiments during the 1950s, where he managed to make perfectly rational adults doubt what they could see with their own eyes. The setup was deceptively simple. Asch gathered groups of 8 people and showed them cards with lines drawn on them. One card displayed a single line, while another showed 3 comparison lines of obviously different lengths. The task seemed foolproof. Just pick which comparison line matched the original. A child could do it correctly. But here's where things got twisted. 7 of the 8 participants were actors, secretly instructed to give the same wrong answer. The real test subject, sitting near the end of the group, would watch person after person confidently choose a line that was clearly incorrect. The results were staggering. 75% of genuine participants conformed to the group's wrong answer at least once during the trials. On average, people went along with the obviously incorrect crowd 37% of the time. These weren't complex moral dilemmas or abstract concepts. These were simple visual comparisons where the right answer was literally staring them in the face. Asch found that even when participants knew the group was wrong, many still went along to avoid standing out. Some convinced themselves they must be seeing things incorrectly. Others admitted they knew the right answer, but couldn't bear the social pressure of disagreeing. The implications extend far beyond laboratory settings. This same mechanism drives everything from workplace groupthink to political echo chambers, showing how social pressure can override individual judgment even when the stakes are much higher than matching line lengths. Double-bind communication is a psychological trap where someone receives 2 contradictory messages that cannot both be satisfied at the same time, creating a no-win situation that can drive the recipient towards psychological breakdown. Psychiatrist Gregory Bateson developed this concept in the 1950s while studying communication patterns in families with schizophrenic children. He noticed parents would give their children conflicting verbal and nonverbal messages simultaneously. A mother might say, "Come give me a hug," while her body language clearly signals rejection and withdrawal. The child faces an impossible choice: obey the words and face emotional rejection, or avoid the hug and be accused of not loving their mother. The original theory suggested this pattern could actually cause schizophrenia by fragmenting a person's ability to process reality coherently. While modern research has largely debunked the direct causation claim, the psychological damage from repeated double-bind situations remains very real. The communication pattern creates what Bateson called a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. The victim cannot escape the situation, cannot comment on the contradiction, and cannot satisfy both demands. This generates intense anxiety, confusion, and eventual learned helplessness. Manipulative individuals and institutions have weaponized double-bind communication as a control mechanism. Abusive partners might demand complete honesty while punishing their victim for telling uncomfortable truths. Corporate environments sometimes demand innovation, while simultaneously punishing any deviation from established protocols. The technique proves particularly devastating because it attacks the victim's ability to trust their own perception of reality, making them increasingly dependent on the manipulator for guidance through the contradictory landscape they've created. Biderman's chart of coercion is a psychological blueprint that reveals how the human mind can be systematically dismantled and rebuilt through 8 precise techniques. Developed by sociologist Albert Biderman in 1957, this framework emerged from his analysis of how Chinese interrogators broke down American prisoners of war during the Korean conflict. The chart maps out a terrifyingly effective process that doesn't rely on physical violence. Instead, it targets the psychological foundations that keep a person's identity intact. The 8 methods work in sequence like a psychological assembly line in reverse. Isolation cuts the target off from all familiar social connections, creating a void where doubt can flourish. Monopolization of perception floods their environment with controlled information while blocking out competing viewpoints. Induced debility and exhaustion weaken physical and mental resistance through sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, and relentless stress. The system then introduces threats that create fear without immediate follow-through, followed by occasional indulgences that create false hope and gratitude. Demonstrating omnipotence shows the target that resistance is futile, while degradation strips away their sense of self-worth and dignity. Finally, enforcing trivial demands conditions compliance through meaningless tasks that seem harmless but establish a pattern of obedience. What makes Biderman's work particularly unsettling is how these same techniques appear in domestic abuse situations, cult recruitment, and even certain advertising strategies. The chart has become an unofficial manual studied by law enforcement, military personnel, and unfortunately, those with darker intentions. The framework reveals that breaking someone's will doesn't require exotic methods or advanced technology. It simply requires patience, control of environment, and a systematic approach to dismantling human psychological defenses. MK-Ultra mind fragmentation is one of the most disturbing chapters in documented psychological experimentation. This wasn't science fiction or conspiracy theory, but a real Central Intelligence Agency program that ran from 1953 to 1973. The fragmentation technique aimed to completely shatter a person's existing personality and memories, creating what researchers called a blank slate for reprogramming. Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal became the primary architect of these methods, using a combination he termed psychic driving. Cameron's patients, many seeking treatment for minor conditions like anxiety or depression, were subjected to massive electroshock treatments up to 40 times the normal intensity. He would then play recorded messages on loop for weeks, sometimes months, while patients remained in drug-induced comas. The goal was to erase their existing personalities entirely. One documented case involved a woman named Linda McDonald, who entered the hospital for mild postpartum depression. After Cameron's treatment, she couldn't recognize her husband or children, had lost 25 years of memories, and needed to relearn basic functions like using a toilet. The fragmentation process relied on overwhelming the mind's natural defenses through sensory deprivation, extreme stress, and chemical disruption. Patients were kept in isolation chambers, given powerful hallucinogens like lysergic acid diethylamide, and subjected to extreme temperature variations. What makes this particularly chilling is the meticulous documentation. The CIA kept detailed records, tracking which combinations of drugs, electricity, and psychological pressure produced the most complete personality breakdown. They measured success by how thoroughly they could eliminate a person's sense of self. The program only came to light in 1975 when congressional investigations revealed thousands of pages of previously classified documents. Many victims never recovered their original personalities, remaining permanently altered by these experiments conducted in the name of national security. Project Artichoke is the Central Intelligence Agency's most disturbing attempt to turn human beings into remote-controlled weapons. Operating from 1951 to the late 1950s, this program went far beyond simple interrogation techniques. The primary goal of Project Artichoke was to determine whether a person could be involuntarily made to perform an act of attempted assassination. A classified 1954 memo posed the chilling question: can an individual of redacted descent be made to perform an act of attempted assassination involuntarily under the influence of artichoke? The program's methods read like a torture manual. CIA interrogators applied artichoke techniques including hypnosis and massive use of chemicals under cover of medical treatment, sometimes holding subjects under artichoke techniques for approximately 12 hours. Artichoke teams used heroin on a routine basis and determined that heroin can be useful in reverse because of the stresses produced when they are withdrawn from those who are addicted to their use. The scope was vast. The agency logged numerous, probably several hundred experiments with hypnotism during 1951, 1952, and 1953. They tested forced morphine addiction, LSD administration, sensory deprivation, and total isolation on unwitting subjects. Even CIA agents were secretly drugged to test the effects. Sidney Gottlieb, nicknamed the Poisoner-in-Chief, ran the program from the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. The CIA sought to establish control over what it perceived as the weaker and less intelligent segments of society, or for potential agents, defectors, refugees, prisoners of war, and others. Teams operated in safe houses across Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. One documented case involved a foreign asset who had stopped cooperating with the agency. The plan was to drug him at a social gathering, apply hypnosis, and program him to attempt an assassination. Whether this actually occurred remains classified, but the memo coldly noted that after the attempt, the subject would be taken into custody by the redacted government and thereby disposed of. Project Artichoke eventually evolved into the more infamous MK-Ultra program in 1953, but its legacy of treating human beings as programmable machines marked a dark chapter in intelligence history that would span decades. Operation Chaos Psychological Warfare is one of the most extensive domestic surveillance operations ever conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency against American citizens. Running from 1967 to 1974, this program violated the CIA's own charter by targeting anti-war protesters, civil rights activists, and anyone the government deemed subversive. The operation began under President Lyndon Johnson's direct orders and expanded dramatically under Richard Nixon. Led by CIA Director Richard Helms, Counterintelligence Chief James Jesus Angleton, and Operations Head Richard Ober, Chaos used psychological warfare techniques borrowed directly from foreign espionage operations and turned them against Americans. The program's psychological manipulation went far beyond simple surveillance. CIA agents created detailed psychological profiles of protest leaders, mapping their personal vulnerabilities, relationships, and behavioral patterns. These profiles were then used to design targeted disruption campaigns. Agents would spread false rumors designed to create paranoia and mistrust within activist groups, plant provocateurs to incite violence that would discredit peaceful movements, and even coordinate with local police to ensure arrests happened at psychologically damaging moments. The technical infrastructure behind chaos was staggering for its time. The CIA developed a computer system called Hydra that could cross-reference and analyze surveillance data from multiple sources. This system contained files on over 300,000 Americans and detailed dossiers on 7,200 individuals. The computer could link casual acquaintances mentioned in passing during wiretapped conversations, creating vast webs of surveillance that trapped completely innocent people. Chaos agents infiltrated universities across the country, posing as students to learn the language and culture of the movements they were targeting. These deep-cover operatives would spend months or even years building trust within activist circles. Some agents even participated in protests and got arrested to maintain their cover, creating false criminal records that the government later used to discredit the movements. The program's reach extended into the most private aspects of American life. The CIA intercepted mail from prominent figures including civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., chess champion Bobby Fischer, Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling, and author John Steinbeck. They purchased a garbage collection company to steal documents from the Israeli embassy and Jewish organizations, demonstrating how far the surveillance web extended beyond its stated anti-war focus. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological warfare campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. Chaos operatives compiled intimate details about his personal life, relationships, and private conversations, then used this information in attempts to blackmail and psychologically destabilize him. The program treated America's most prominent civil rights leader as an enemy agent deserving of the same treatment as foreign spies. The operation finally unraveled when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh exposed it in a 1974 New York Times article. The revelation that the CIA had been conducting illegal domestic surveillance operations triggered a massive scandal. Congressional investigations revealed that the agency had systematically violated American civil liberties for nearly a decade, using psychological warfare techniques against citizens whose only crime was exercising their constitutional rights. The exposure of chaos led to the Church Committee investigations and the Rockefeller Commission, fundamentally changing how intelligence agencies operate domestically. Yet many of the psychological manipulation techniques pioneered during chaos have allegedly resurfaced in various forms, making it a blueprint for how governments can use psychological warfare to control domestic dissent while maintaining plausible deniability. COINTELPRO Mental Manipulation is a documented collection of psychological warfare techniques used by the FBI from 1956 to 1971 to disrupt and neutralize domestic political groups. The program's mental manipulation tactics went far beyond simple surveillance. Agents would create fake documents designed to spark paranoia and distrust within target organizations. They forged letters between group leaders, fabricating romantic affairs and financial betrayals that never actually happened. The FBI's Racial Intelligence Section developed what they called bad jacketing, deliberately spreading rumors that loyal members were actually informants. This technique was devastatingly effective because it created an atmosphere where no one could trust anyone else. Activists would spend more time hunting for imaginary spies than actually organizing. One particularly cruel operation involved sending fake death threats to activists' family members, complete with detailed knowledge of their daily routines to make the threats seem credible. The psychological impact often caused targets to withdraw from political activity entirely. The program also used a technique called snitch jacketing, where they would plant evidence suggesting someone was cooperating with authorities. In some cases, this led to violence against innocent people who were never actually informants. Documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1970s revealed that COINTELPRO agents received training in psychological manipulation techniques borrowed from military psychological operations. They learned to exploit existing personality conflicts within groups and amplify them until organizations collapsed from internal fighting. The Black Panther Party was particularly targeted with these mental manipulation campaigns. The FBI successfully convinced different chapters that other chapters were planning to harm them, leading to armed confrontations between members of the same organization. Operation Paperclip Psychological Research is the largely classified program that brought Nazi psychologists and their human experimentation data directly into American intelligence operations after World War II. While most people know Operation Paperclip recruited rocket scientists like Werner von Braun, the psychological wing remains far more secretive. The program specifically targeted Nazi researchers who had conducted brutal psychological experiments in concentration camps, viewing their data as too valuable to abandon to Soviet forces. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, had overseen high-altitude experiments that killed dozens of prisoners at Dachau. Despite this, he was quietly relocated to Texas, where he helped develop NASA's psychological screening programs for astronauts. The Americans were particularly interested in Nazi research on interrogation techniques, sensory deprivation, and what they called will-breaking methods. Documents declassified in the 1990s reveal that at least 23 Nazi psychologists were secretly integrated into U.S. intelligence programs between 1945 and 1955. These scientists brought with them detailed records of psychological torture techniques, drug experimentation protocols, and behavioral modification studies conducted on unwilling subjects. The data was considered so valuable that the CIA created entire departments specifically to analyze and apply these findings. The psychological research from Paperclip directly influenced the development of MK-Ultra in the 1950s. Many of the interrogation and mind control techniques later used by American intelligence can be traced back to Nazi experiments that had been deemed too extreme even for wartime. The irony wasn't lost on some officials that the country that had just defeated fascism was now employing fascist scientists to develop weapons of psychological warfare against its own future enemies. Psychic driving and deep brainwashing is a psychiatric technique that sounds like science fiction, but was practiced extensively during the 1950s and 60s at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, the institute's director, believed human personality could be completely erased and rebuilt from scratch. His method involved placing patients into drug-induced comas lasting weeks or even months while playing the same audio messages on repeat, sometimes for 16 hours per day. The process began with what Cameron called de-patterning, using a combination of LSD, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation to break down a patient's existing personality and memories. Once the mind was sufficiently blank, the psychic driving phase would begin. Patients would hear recorded messages designed to implant new thoughts, behaviors, and even entire belief systems. The technique received funding through the CIA's MK-Ultra program, though many staff members had no idea their research was connected to intelligence operations. Cameron genuinely believed he was curing mental illness by giving patients completely fresh personalities. Linda McDonald entered the institute in 1958 as a mother of 5, seeking treatment for mild depression. She emerged months later unable to recognize her own children, having lost all memory of her previous life. She had to relearn basic functions like walking and using the bathroom. The audio messages varied from simple phrases like, "You are a good wife and mother," repeated thousands of times, to complex personality restructuring scripts. Some patients received contradictory messages simultaneously through different speakers, creating internal psychological conflicts that persisted for years. Several patients did emerge with dramatically altered personalities, though rarely in the intended direction. Most suffered permanent memory loss and required lifelong care. Korean War brainwashing techniques is a systematic approach to psychological manipulation that emerged during the 1950s conflict and fundamentally changed how the world understood coercive persuasion. When Chinese and North Korean forces captured American prisoners of war, they didn't just lock them up and wait for the war to end. Instead, they implemented a carefully designed program that combined physical deprivation with psychological pressure to break down the mental resistance of captured soldiers. The process typically began with complete isolation from fellow prisoners. American POWs were separated from their units and placed in solitary confinement for weeks or months. During this time, captors would alternate between harsh treatment and unexpected kindness, creating a state of psychological dependency. Sleep deprivation played a crucial role in weakening mental defenses. Guards would wake prisoners at random intervals throughout the night, preventing them from achieving deep, restorative sleep. This constant exhaustion made it increasingly difficult for POWs to think clearly or maintain their resolve. The indoctrination sessions themselves could last 8 to 12 hours daily. Prisoners were forced to attend lengthy lectures about communist ideology while being fed a steady diet of anti-American propaganda. Captors would demand that POWs write and rewrite confessions of their supposed crimes against the Korean people. What made these techniques particularly effective was the systematic use of rewards and punishments. Prisoners who showed even slight cooperation might receive better food, warmer clothing, or brief contact with other Americans. Those who resisted faced extended isolation, reduced rations, or psychological torture. The results were disturbing enough to shock military leadership back in Washington. 21 American soldiers refused repatriation at the war's end, choosing to remain in communist China. Additionally, several dozen POWs had made radio broadcasts criticizing American involvement in Korea or confessing to alleged war crimes. These incidents led to the coining of the term brainwashing itself, translated from the Chinese phrase "xinao," meaning to wash the brain. The techniques developed during the Korean conflict would later influence interrogation methods, cult recruitment strategies, and even advertising psychology for decades to come. Chinese thought reform programs is a systematic approach to psychological restructuring that emerged in communist China during the 1940s and 50s. These programs targeted intellectuals, political prisoners, and anyone deemed ideologically unreliable by the state. The process typically lasted anywhere from 6 months to several years, and involved breaking down an individual's existing belief system through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. Subjects were placed in small groups where they faced constant criticism from peers who had already undergone the transformation. Sleep deprivation played a crucial role, with sessions often extending 18 to 20 hours per day. Participants were forced to write detailed confessions about their past thoughts and actions, then have these confessions torn apart by the group. The cycle repeated until the subject achieved what officials called genuine understanding of their errors. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, who interviewed former prisoners in Hong Kong during the 1950s, documented how the programs created a state he termed ideological totalism. Subjects reported feeling completely dependent on their captors for basic needs, while simultaneously developing genuine belief in the very ideology used to break them down. The most unsettling aspect was how many subjects emerged as true believers rather than simply compliant prisoners. They would voluntarily return to inform on family members and former friends, convinced they were performing a moral duty. These techniques later influenced interrogation methods worldwide and contributed to our modern understanding of psychological coercion. The programs demonstrated how environment manipulation, social pressure, and exhaustion could fundamentally alter someone's core beliefs without traditional physical torture. Some reformed individuals spent decades unable to trust their own thoughts, constantly second-guessing whether their feelings were genuine or products of their conditioning. Isolation tank sensory deprivation is a technique that locks subjects inside soundproof chambers filled with body temperature salt water, cutting off virtually all external stimuli for hours at a time. The darkness is so complete that people report losing track of where their body ends and the water begins. The method gained notoriety through neurologist John C. Lilly's experiments in the 1950s and 60s. Lilly discovered that removing sensory input didn't put the brain to sleep as expected. Instead, subjects experienced vivid hallucinations, out-of-body sensations, and what they described as contact with non-human intelligences. Lilly himself claimed to communicate with extraterrestrial beings during extended sessions lasting up to 8 hours. The Central Intelligence Agency took immediate interest in Lilly's work, funding research into whether sensory deprivation could break down psychological defenses for interrogation purposes. Subjects isolated for 24 to 48 hours showed increased susceptibility to suggestion and memory manipulation. Some emerged claiming their sense of personal identity had completely dissolved. Modern brain imaging reveals that sensory deprivation triggers a cascade of neurochemical changes. The brain floods with naturally occurring compounds that mirror the effects of powerful psychedelic substances. Areas responsible for self-awareness and time perception go dark, while regions associated with creativity and pattern recognition become hyperactive. Commercial float centers now market the experience as relaxation therapy, but longtime practitioners report far stranger effects. Regular users describe accessing memories from early childhood with photographic clarity, solving complex problems that had stumped them for months, and experiencing what they call downloads of information from unknown sources. The most unsettling reports involve shared experiences between people floating in separate tanks simultaneously, suggesting the isolation might actually connect consciousness in ways current science cannot explain. Sleep deprivation interrogation is a psychological technique that exploits one of the most fundamental human needs to break down mental resistance and extract information. Rather than relying on physical pain, this method weaponizes exhaustion itself, turning the body's natural sleep cycle into a tool of psychological pressure. The science behind this technique centers on how sleep loss systematically dismantles cognitive function. After just 24 hours without sleep, the brain begins showing impairments similar to alcohol intoxication. Decision-making deteriorates, memory becomes unreliable, and most critically for interrogators, the ability to maintain consistent lies or rehearsed stories starts falling apart. By the 72-hour mark, subjects often experience microsleeps where they briefly lose consciousness while appearing awake, hallucinations begin manifesting, and paranoia sets in. The interrogator doesn't need to do much beyond keeping the person awake and occasionally asking questions. The sleep-deprived brain essentially interrogates itself. The Central Intelligence Agency developed sophisticated protocols around this technique during the Cold War era. Documented in their KUBARK manual from 1963, they discovered that combining sleep deprivation with temperature manipulation, uncomfortable positions, and sensory bombardment could accelerate the psychological breakdown process significantly. One of the most extensively documented applications occurred at Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility, where detainees were subjected to sleep schedules that prevented REM sleep for weeks at a time. FBI emails released through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that interrogators would play loud music, flash strobe lights, and adjust temperatures every few hours to maintain constant wakefulness. The technique proved so effective that some subjects would begin fabricating information just to be allowed to sleep, which ironically made the intelligence gathered less reliable. The exhausted mind becomes incredibly suggestible, often agreeing with whatever the interrogator implies just to end the ordeal. What makes sleep deprivation insidious is its invisible nature. Unlike physical marks, the effects are entirely psychological and temporary, making it difficult to prove after the fact. The subject's own body becomes the weapon, creating a form of psychological torture that leaves no physical evidence behind. Folie à deux in mass hysteria events is a psychiatric phenomenon where shared delusions spread like wildfire through communities, turning individual madness into collective chaos. The term literally means madness of two in French, describing how one person's psychotic delusions can be transmitted to and fully adopted by another person in close contact. But when this psychological contagion escapes the confines of small groups, it morphs into something far more spectacular and terrifying. The mechanism works through emotional synchronization and social proof. The primary individual, usually someone with genuine psychiatric symptoms, convinces others that their distorted reality is the truth. These secondary cases don't develop the delusion independently, they absorb it wholesale from the original source. Historical records document hundreds of mass hysteria events that follow this pattern. The Salem witch trials of 1692 began with 2 young girls experiencing seizures and claiming supernatural persecution. Their symptoms rapidly spread to other children in the village, each new case reinforcing the validity of the original claims. The Dancing Plague of 1518 in Strasbourg saw over 400 people compulsively dancing for days until some collapsed from exhaustion. Medical historians now believe it started with one woman named Frau Trophea, whose manic dancing episodes triggered a citywide outbreak of the same behavior. More recently, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962 began at a mission school when 3 girls started laughing uncontrollably. Within weeks, the laughter had spread to over 1,000 people across multiple villages, forcing schools to close and communities to evacuate. Modern technology has amplified these effects exponentially. Social media platforms can now spread psychogenic symptoms across continents in real time. The 2010 to 2020 period saw numerous cases of teenagers developing sudden onset tics after watching videos of others with similar symptoms, creating what researchers call mass sociogenic illness in the digital age. The disturbing reality is that participants genuinely experience their symptoms, making these events notoriously difficult to contain once they begin spreading through susceptible populations. Manufacturing consent theory is a framework that claims mainstream media functions as a sophisticated propaganda system, filtering information to serve elite interests while maintaining the illusion of independent journalism. Developed by linguist Noam Chomsky and economist Edward Herman in 1988, the theory outlines 5 specific filters that allegedly shape what news reaches the public. The first filter involves media ownership concentration among wealthy corporations and individuals who naturally protect their business interests. The second filter centers on advertising revenue dependency, where media outlets avoid content that might upset major advertisers. The third filter examines how news organizations rely heavily on official sources from government agencies, corporations, and established experts, essentially allowing these institutions to set the agenda. The fourth filter describes flack, organized efforts to discredit unfavorable coverage through complaints, lawsuits, and public relations campaigns. The fifth filter originally focused on anti-communist ideology during the Cold War, later expanding to include anti-terrorism narratives that justify military interventions and domestic surveillance programs. Herman and Chomsky analyzed coverage of simultaneous atrocities in Cambodia and East Timor during the 1970s. Despite similar death tolls, American media extensively covered Cambodian killings by the communist Khmer Rouge, while largely ignoring the East Timor genocide carried out by Indonesian forces using American weapons. This selective attention allegedly demonstrated how the filters operate in practice. The theory suggests that journalists internalize these constraints without explicit censorship, creating a self-regulating system that appears free while consistently supporting establishment viewpoints. Critics argue this framework oversimplifies complex editorial decisions, though supporters point to studies showing measurable bias patterns in conflict coverage and economic reporting. The model has found renewed relevance in discussions about social media algorithms and corporate influence over digital information platforms. Spectacle society control is a theory that claims modern civilization keeps people docile not through force, but through an endless stream of distracting entertainment and manufactured desires. French philosopher Guy Debord developed this concept in 1967, arguing that authentic human experience had been replaced by a constant flow of images, products, and media designed to keep populations passive. Debord believed that people no longer live their own lives, but instead watch representations of life unfold before them. The mechanism works by flooding society with so much visual stimulation that critical thinking becomes nearly impossible. Television, advertising, social media, and celebrity culture create what Debord called the spectacle, an artificial reality that feels more real than actual experience. Instead of participating in genuine community or meaningful work, People become consumers of pre-packaged experiences. They watch sports rather than play them, follow influencers rather than develop their own interests, and buy products that promise identity rather than creating authentic selves. The situationist movement that De Boer founded attempted to disrupt this system through bizarre public performances and pranks designed to shock people out of their media-induced trance. They would rearrange store displays, create fake news stories, and stage theatrical events in public spaces. Modern applications of spectacle theory point to how social media platforms engineer addiction through endless scrolling, how streaming services use algorithms to keep viewers watching for hours, and how shopping has transformed into entertainment rather than necessity. Critics note that people spend more time curating their online personas than developing real relationships, and that political movements now focus more on viral content than substantive policy changes. The theory suggests that this constant bombardment of spectacle prevents people from recognizing their own powerlessness or organizing for meaningful change. Collective unconscious manipulation is the theoretical practice of targeting the deepest shared layers of human psychology to influence entire populations simultaneously. Carl Jung proposed that beneath our individual minds lies a collective unconscious filled with universal symbols and archetypes that every human inherits regardless of culture or upbringing. The manipulation operates through archetypal symbols that bypass conscious reasoning entirely. The mother figure, the hero's journey, the shadow self, and death and rebirth cycles appear across every civilization because they're supposedly hardwired into our species. Advertisers discovered that tapping into these primordial images could trigger purchasing decisions before customers even realized they were being influenced. Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, allegedly used these principles in the 1920s when he convinced women to smoke cigarettes by framing them as torches of freedom. He wasn't just selling tobacco, he was activating the archetypal rebel against patriarchal authority. Modern practitioners focus on mass media campaigns that embed archetypal imagery into entertainment and news. The hero saving the world, the wise mentor, the dangerous outsider threatening the community. These patterns repeat endlessly because they supposedly speak to psychological structures that evolved over millions of years. The most unsettling aspect involves synchronized dream manipulation. Some researchers claim that introducing specific symbols into mass media can actually influence the collective dreaming patterns of entire regions. During the Cold War, both superpowers reportedly experimented with broadcasting subliminal archetypal content through television signals. Corporate logo design represents the most visible application. McDonald's golden arches mirror ancient symbols of abundance and prosperity. Apple's bitten fruit connects to humanity's oldest story of forbidden knowledge. These aren't accidents, but calculated attempts to speak directly to the collective unconscious. The line between legitimate marketing psychology and mass manipulation grows thinner each year, as neuroscience reveals just how predictable human responses to archetypal triggers really are. Mass formation psychosis is a psychological phenomenon where large populations fall into a trance-like state, becoming disconnected from reality and capable of extreme behaviors they would normally reject. Belgian psychologist Dr. Matthias Desmet brought this concept into mainstream discussion, drawing from decades of research into crowd psychology and totalitarian movements. The process requires 4 specific conditions to take hold. First, widespread feelings of social isolation and loneliness must exist within a population. Second, people need to experience a lack of meaning or purpose in their lives. Third, high levels of free-floating anxiety and frustration must be present, creating psychological tension without clear direction. Finally, there must be a shared narrative that channels this anxiety toward a specific target or solution. When these conditions align, something remarkable happens to human psychology. Individuals begin to focus intensely on a single narrative, often involving a perceived threat that requires collective action. This focus becomes so consuming that people lose their ability to think critically about information that contradicts the narrative. They experience a kind of hypnotic state where dissenting voices become not just wrong, but dangerous. Dr. Desmet points to historical examples throughout the 20th century. During Stalin's reign, Soviet citizens reported neighbors and family members to authorities, genuinely believing they were protecting society. In Nazi Germany, ordinary people participated in or ignored atrocities, convinced they were serving a greater good. The Salem witch trials demonstrated how entire communities could become consumed by irrational fears, leading to the execution of innocent people. What makes mass formation particularly dangerous is how it affects perception itself. People in this state don't simply disagree with opposing viewpoints. They literally cannot process contradictory information. Their brains filter out facts that challenge the dominant narrative while amplifying any evidence that supports it. This creates an echo chamber effect that strengthens with each repetition. The phenomenon also creates intense social bonding among participants. People who felt isolated and meaningless suddenly experience a powerful sense of purpose and belonging. This psychological reward makes the formation extremely difficult to break, even when faced with clear evidence of its destructiveness. Social contagion engineering is the deliberate manipulation of how behaviors, emotions, and ideas spread through populations, treating human psychology like a viral outbreak that can be controlled and directed. The concept builds on decades of research showing how certain behaviors literally spread like diseases through social networks. Stanford researcher Mark Granovetter discovered in the 1970s that job opportunities spread through weak social ties more effectively than close relationships, laying groundwork for understanding how information cascades through communities. Modern practitioners exploit three core mechanisms to engineer social contagion. First, they identify superspreaders, individuals with unusually high social connectivity who can amplify messages across multiple networks simultaneously. Second, they craft sticky content designed to trigger specific emotional responses that compel sharing. Third, they manipulate timing and context to create artificial urgency or social proof. The 2010s saw sophisticated applications during political campaigns. Cambridge Analytica's operations demonstrated how micro-targeted emotional triggers could create localized outbreaks of political sentiment that spread organically through Facebook networks. Their internal documents revealed techniques for identifying psychologically vulnerable individuals who were more likely to share divisive content. Corporate applications include manufactured viral marketing campaigns, where companies seed fake grassroots movements to promote products. The Ice Bucket Challenge, while raising legitimate funds for research, also served as a blueprint for how artificial social pressure could be engineered to achieve massive participation rates. More concerning applications involve engineered panic responses. Research by sociologist Zeynep Tufekci revealed how algorithmic amplification could turn minor local incidents into nationwide movements within hours, suggesting that social contagion could be weaponized to create controlled chaos. The technique exploits humanity's fundamental need for social validation, turning our greatest strength into a potential weakness. Mimetic warfare psychology is the systematic application of psychological principles to weaponize viral content and cultural transmission for strategic advantage. This field emerged from the intersection of military strategy, cognitive psychology, and internet culture during the early 2000s. The core premise revolves around Richard Dawkins' concept of memes as self-replicating units of cultural information, but twisted into deliberate psychological operations. Practitioners study how specific combinations of imagery, text, and emotional triggers can bypass rational thought and embed themselves directly into target populations' collective consciousness. During the 2010s, military research divisions began cataloging the psychological mechanisms that make certain content irresistibly shareable. They discovered that memes exploiting cognitive biases like confirmation bias and social proof could spread faster than traditional propaganda while appearing organic and grassroots. The technique relies heavily on what psychologists call the elaboration likelihood model. By crafting content that triggers peripheral root processing, mimetic warfare specialists can influence attitudes without engaging critical thinking. The target processes the information quickly, emotionally, and often unconsciously. Notable case studies include the documented use of carefully crafted visual memes during various election cycles, where specific color combinations, fonts, and symbolic imagery were tested for maximum psychological impact. Research teams would A/B test thousands of variations to identify which elements most effectively triggered desired emotional responses. The psychological warfare aspect becomes apparent in how these operations target specific personality types. Introverted individuals respond differently to mimetic content than extroverts, and practitioners maintain detailed psychological profiles to optimize content for different demographic segments. Modern mimetic warfare psychology incorporates neuroscience research on mirror neurons and emotional contagion, explaining how certain visual patterns can literally synchronize brainwave activity across large populations viewing the same content simultaneously. Astroturfing and artificial consensus is the practice of manufacturing fake grassroots movements to create the illusion of widespread public support for ideas, products, or policies. The name comes from AstroTurf, the artificial grass brand, contrasting it with genuine grassroots movements that grow naturally from the ground up. Corporate giants and political operatives have weaponized this technique to reshape public opinion without leaving fingerprints. Instead of authentic citizen voices, teams of paid actors flood comment sections, social media platforms, and public forums with coordinated messaging designed to look spontaneous. The tobacco industry pioneered many of these methods in the 1950s and 60s, creating front groups with names like the Tobacco Institute Research Committee to cast doubt on smoking health risks. These organizations employed scientists and funded studies specifically to muddy the waters around lung cancer research, making it appear as though scientific consensus was still debated when it wasn't. Modern astroturfing operations have evolved far beyond simple fake reviews. Sophisticated bot networks can simulate thousands of individual users across multiple platforms, each with unique posting patterns and believable backstories. These digital personas engage in conversations, share content, and even argue with each other to create the appearance of organic debate. One documented case involved a major telecommunications company hiring a public relations firm to create fake citizen groups opposing municipal broadband initiatives. These groups organized rallies, submitted letters to local newspapers, and testified at city council meetings, all while being funded by the very company that would lose customers to public internet services. The psychological impact relies on social proof, the tendency for people to follow what they perceive as majority opinion. When someone sees dozens of comments supporting a particular viewpoint, they're more likely to adopt that position themselves, even if those comments were generated by the same marketing team. Political astroturfing has become particularly sophisticated, with operations spanning multiple countries and languages. State actors and political parties deploy armies of fake accounts to amplify certain narratives while suppressing others, creating echo chambers that feel organic but are carefully orchestrated. The effectiveness lies in its invisibility. Unlike traditional advertising, astroturfing disguises itself as authentic human expression, making it nearly impossible for average consumers to distinguish between genuine opinions and manufactured consensus. Overton window manipulation is the deliberate process of shifting what ideas society considers acceptable to discuss in public discourse. Named after political analyst Joseph Overton in the 1990s, the window describes the narrow range of policies that politicians can support without appearing too extreme to voters. What most people don't realize is how systematically this window gets moved. The manipulation works through a technique called anchoring. By introducing increasingly radical positions at the edges, previously extreme ideas suddenly appear moderate by comparison. Think tanks and advocacy groups will deliberately promote ideas they know are too far outside current acceptability, not because they expect immediate adoption, but because they're repositioning the entire conversation. A classic example played out with healthcare policy in the United States. Universal healthcare was once considered fringe socialism, completely outside the window. Advocates began by proposing single-payer systems they knew would be rejected, which made public options seem reasonable, which in turn made insurance marketplace reforms appear conservative. The process typically follows 5 stages moving from unthinkable to policy. Unthinkable becomes radical. Radical becomes acceptable. Acceptable becomes sensible. And sensible becomes popular before finally reaching policy implementation. Corporate interests have mastered this technique particularly well. The tobacco industry spent decades moving the conversation about smoking from harmless to personal choice, rather than allowing it to land on public health crisis. They funded think tanks to promote ideas about individual responsibility and government overreach, gradually shifting where the center of debate would fall. Digital platforms have accelerated window manipulation dramatically. Algorithms can expose millions of people to gradually shifting content, normalizing previously fringe viewpoints through repeated exposure. What took decades of institutional effort can now happen in months through coordinated online campaigns. The most sophisticated practitioners understand that moving the window requires patience and institutional credibility. They establish research organizations, fund academic studies, and cultivate media relationships years before pushing their actual agenda into mainstream consideration. Behavioral control via frequency and subliminal messaging is the practice of embedding hidden audio or visual stimuli below the threshold of conscious perception to influence behavior and decision-making. The concept gained serious attention in 1957, when marketing researcher James Vicary claimed he increased Coca-Cola sales by 18% and popcorn sales by 57% by flashing "Drink Coca-Cola" and "Eat popcorn" for 1/3000th of a second during movie screenings. Vicary later admitted the study was fabricated, but the damage was done, and public fear of subliminal manipulation exploded. The CIA's MKUltra program extensively researched subliminal techniques during the 1950s and 60s. Declassified documents reveal experiments using subliminal audio messages combined with sensory deprivation and pharmaceutical intervention. Dr. Ewan Cameron at Allen Memorial Institute played looped subliminal recordings to patients for weeks, claiming to reprogram their personalities entirely. Modern research shows mixed results. Wilson Bryan Key popularized the idea that advertisers hide sexual imagery in ice cubes and product photography, though scientific studies consistently fail to demonstrate meaningful behavioral changes from these techniques. However, more sophisticated approaches show promise. Binaural beats, where slightly different frequencies are played in each ear, can measurably alter brainwave patterns. Studies at Heinrich Heine University found that 40 Hz gamma wave entrainment improved cognitive performance, while 8 Hz alpha waves increased relaxation responses. The controversy deepens with frequency weapons. The long-range acoustic device, used by military and police forces, can project focused sound beams causing disorientation and pain. Russia's alleged use of sonic attacks against American diplomats in Cuba demonstrates how sound frequencies can cause physical and psychological symptoms. Digital platforms now enable unprecedented subliminal delivery. Apps claiming to embed positive affirmations in music tracks have gained millions of users, despite limited evidence of effectiveness. The placebo effect alone may account for reported improvements in confidence and motivation. The line between legitimate neurofeedback therapy and manipulation continues to blur as technology advances. Remote neural monitoring is a claim that certain government agencies or defense contractors possess the ability to monitor and influence a person's thoughts using advanced electromagnetic or satellite-based technology. According to believers in the concept, remote neural monitoring, often shortened to RNM, can scan, interpret, and even modify brainwave activity from a distance without physical contact. The basic premise hinges on the brain acting like a biological radio, emitting measurable electrical signals. These signals, it's claimed, can be picked up by high-frequency devices, allowing a third party to essentially read minds, or inject thoughts. Some claim the technology works in tandem with voice-to-skull systems, where synthetic thoughts or inner voices are transmitted back into a person's mind. This is sometimes described as a digital form of telepathy, where emotional states or mental patterns are artificially induced. Theories about how this is achieved vary, but many cite patents related to neural interfaces, non-lethal weapon systems, and behavior-influencing radio frequencies filed between the 1970s and early 2000s. One of the most well-known names tied to these claims is John Saint. Claire Acquet, who filed a lawsuit in the 1990s alleging that the National Security Agency was using such technology on American citizens. While the case was dismissed, it has since been cited widely in RNM discussions. Supporters often point to specific symptoms reported by alleged victims: hearing voices, sudden changes in mood or behavior, and a perceived inability to control one's own thoughts or impulses. Critics argue these effects can be explained by psychological conditions, but the technology itself, brain-machine interfaces, and long-distance neural scanning, is at least partially supported by publicly acknowledged research. The most controversial aspect isn't whether remote influence is possible, but whether it's already being used secretly, at scale, and without consent. As with many entries in this iceberg, it's not just about what can be done, it's about who might already be doing it. Psychotronic weapons research is the study of devices that allegedly use electromagnetic fields, radio frequencies, or other forms of energy to remotely influence human behavior, emotions, and physical health. These theoretical weapons would operate by targeting the electrical activity in the human brain and nervous system, potentially causing anything from mild disorientation to complete behavioral control. The concept emerged during the Cold War when both Soviet and American researchers investigated whether electromagnetic radiation could be weaponized against human targets. Soviet scientist Alexander Dubrov coined the term psychotronics in the 1970s, describing it as the interaction between living organisms and electromagnetic fields. The most documented research occurred at the Walter Reed Army Institute in the 1980s and 90s, where scientists studied how microwave radiation affected brain tissue. Dr. Alan Frey discovered that pulsed microwaves could create audible sounds directly inside a person's head, a phenomenon now known as the Frey effect, or microwave auditory effect. Russian researcher Vladimir Poponin claimed his government developed devices capable of transmitting specific emotional states across distances using extremely low-frequency electromagnetic pulses. According to declassified documents, the Pentagon spent over $20 million investigating similar technologies through programs with names like Project Pandora and Project Bazaar. The alleged symptoms of psychotronic weapon exposure include sudden mood changes, unexplained fatigue, hearing voices or sounds with no external source, and disrupted sleep patterns. Targets reportedly experience these effects even when shielded by conventional materials, leading researchers to explore quantum field interactions as potential delivery mechanisms. Modern concerns focus on the possibility that cell phone towers, Wi-Fi networks, or satellite communications could be modified to carry psychotronic signals. Some researchers point to the increasing prevalence of electromagnetic hypersensitivity as potential evidence of ongoing testing, while mainstream science remains skeptical of most psychotronic weapon claims. The documented biological effects of electromagnetic radiation continue to fuel speculation about their weaponization potential. ELF wave behavioral modification is the theoretical use of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic waves to alter human behavior, emotions, and cognitive function. These waves operate between 3 to 30 Hz, placing them in the same range as human brainwave frequencies. The concept gained traction during the Cold War when both Soviet and American researchers explored whether specific electromagnetic frequencies could influence mood, sleep patterns, and decision-making processes. The appeal was obvious: a completely invisible method of population control that could theoretically be transmitted across vast distances. The most documented case involves the Soviet woodpecker signal, detected by Western intelligence in the 1970s. This massive over-the-horizon radar system transmitted at 10 Hz pulses, leading some researchers to speculate it was designed for more than just military surveillance. Dr. Robert Becker, an orthopedic surgeon and researcher, conducted experiments showing that ELF fields could indeed affect biological systems. His work demonstrated that electromagnetic frequencies could influence healing rates and cellular behavior, though he stopped short of claiming mind control capabilities. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, better known as HAARP, has also attracted attention in this context. While officially designed for ionospheric research, some theorists suggest its ability to generate ELF waves through atmospheric heating could serve behavioral modification purposes. The challenge lies in the power requirements. Effective ELF transmission demands enormous antenna arrays and massive energy input, making covert deployment practically difficult. Modern research has confirmed that certain frequencies can affect sleep cycles and potentially influence mood, but the gap between laboratory conditions and real-world behavioral control remains substantial. Microwave auditory effect, also known as the Frey effect, is a documented phenomenon where pulsed microwave radiation can create the perception of sound directly inside a person's head without any external speakers or audio devices. Alan Frey first demonstrated this effect in 1962 while working at General Electric's Advanced Electronics Center. Frey discovered that when he exposed himself and volunteers to pulsed microwave radiation at specific frequencies, they could hear clicking, buzzing, or even voice-like sounds that seemed to originate from inside their skulls. The effect works through thermoelastic expansion, where microwave pulses cause rapid heating of moisture in the inner ear tissues, creating pressure waves that the auditory system interprets as sound. The effect occurs at power levels well below what would cause tissue damage, typically requiring pulse durations of 1 to 100 microseconds at frequencies between 300 MHz to 3 GHz. What makes this particularly unsettling is that the sound bypasses the normal hearing process entirely, meaning even deaf individuals can perceive these phantom voices. The United States military and intelligence agencies quickly recognized the potential applications. Declassified documents from the 1970s and 80s reveal extensive research into what researchers called voice-to-skull technology. The Air Force Research Laboratory published papers exploring whether focused microwave beams could deliver intelligible speech directly into an enemy's head, creating confusion or compliance without the target understanding the source. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet scientists investigated weaponizing the effect. Some researchers proposed using it for crowd control, where specific individuals could receive threatening messages that would appear to come from nowhere, potentially causing panic or disorientation without affecting nearby people. The technology has been linked to reports of unexplained auditory experiences among embassy staff and intelligence operatives, particularly in cases like the mysterious Havana Syndrome incidents. While the exact cause of these health episodes remains disputed, some investigators have theorized that hostile actors might be using advanced microwave weapons based on the Frey effect. Modern applications have expanded beyond military uses. Some researchers have explored therapeutic possibilities, investigating whether the effect could help restore hearing sensations in certain types of deafness. However, the technology remains largely experimental due to safety concerns and the difficulty of generating precisely controlled microwave pulses. The effect requires line-of-sight targeting and works only at relatively short distances, typically within a few meters. Despite these limitations, patents exist for devices claiming to use the Frey effect for everything from non-lethal weapons to advertising systems that could beam messages directly into shoppers' heads. Silent Sound Spread Spectrum is an alleged military technology that claims to transmit subliminal messages and even voices directly into human minds using inaudible sound frequencies. The technology supposedly works by modulating extremely low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, around 14.5 Hz, to carry embedded audio messages that bypass conscious awareness and speak directly to the subconscious. The foundation for these claims stems from a real patent filed by inventor Oliver Lowry in 1992, officially titled Silent Subliminal Presentation System. Lowry's patent describes a method for hiding subliminal messages within carrier audio frequencies that operate above or below normal human hearing range. The patent specifically outlines how these hidden messages could influence behavior and emotional states without the listener's knowledge. Military researchers allegedly expanded this concept into what became known as the squad, or silent sound technology during the 1990s. Documents supposedly leaked from defense contractors describe a system capable of transmitting synthetic telepathy, where operators could beam voices, sounds, or even complex psychological manipulation directly into a target's auditory cortex. The technology allegedly uses microwave frequencies to create the microwave hearing effect, where electromagnetic energy converts to sound perception inside the skull. Claims suggest this technology saw field testing during the Gulf War in 1991, where American forces supposedly used silent sound broadcasts to demoralize Iraqi troops and encourage mass surrenders. Some accounts describe entire units laying down weapons after hearing mysterious voices commanding them to stop fighting. The technology allegedly operates on the principle that certain frequencies can entrain brainwaves, synchronizing neural activity to external rhythms. By transmitting specific frequency patterns, operators could theoretically induce states of relaxation, aggression, confusion, or compliance in targeted individuals or groups. More extreme versions of the technology supposedly allow for the implantation of false memories, the triggering of specific emotional responses, or even the remote control of physical actions through what researchers call synthetic telepathy interfaces. Neurological frequency entrainment is the process of synchronizing brainwave patterns with external rhythmic stimuli to alter mental states and cognitive function. This technique exploits the brain's natural tendency to match its electrical activity to repeated sensory input, creating what researchers call the frequency-following response. The human brain operates on distinct frequency bands that correspond to different states of consciousness. Beta waves at 13 to 30 Hz accompany normal waking awareness, while alpha waves at 8 to 12 Hz emerge during relaxation. Theta frequencies between 4 to 8 Hz occur in deep meditation and light sleep, and delta waves below 4 Hz dominate deep sleep cycles. Practitioners use binaural beats, where slightly different frequencies play in each ear, causing the brain to perceive a third phantom frequency equal to the mathematical difference. Playing 440 Hz in one ear and 444 Hz in the other creates a 4 Hz theta beat that supposedly induces meditative states. The Monroe Institute, founded by Robert Monroe in the 1970s, developed hemisync technology claiming to achieve out-of-body experiences and enhanced learning through frequency entrainment. Their gateway process attracted attention from the Central Intelligence Agency, which declassified documents in the 2010s revealing military interest in consciousness manipulation techniques. Isochronic tones present a single frequency that pulses on and off at specific intervals, while stroboscopic lights flash at corresponding rates to create visual entrainment. Some researchers report subjects entering trance-like states within minutes of exposure, with electroencephalogram readings confirming brainwave synchronization. Commercial applications range from meditation apps promising instant Zen states to sleep aids claiming to eliminate insomnia. The more controversial end involves claims of memory enhancement, pain reduction, and even intelligence boosting through targeted frequency exposure. Dr. Gerald Oster's 1973 research paper, Auditory Beats in the Brain, provided the scientific foundation, though critics argue that meaningful brainwave entrainment requires prolonged exposure and individual calibration rather than one-size-fits-all frequency programs. The darker implications center on potential weaponization for crowd control or interrogation enhancement, though no conclusive evidence supports these applications beyond theoretical speculation. Biorhythm manipulation technology is the alleged use of electromagnetic frequencies, light patterns, and sound waves to artificially alter human biological cycles for control purposes. This concept goes far beyond simple circadian rhythm adjustment, claiming that specific technologies can manipulate the three core biorhythm cycles that supposedly govern human behavior. The theory builds on early 20th century research by Wilhelm Fliess, who proposed that humans operate on predictable 23-day physical cycles, 28-day emotional cycles, and 33-day intellectual cycles. While mainstream science dismissed biorhythm theory decades ago, certain researchers have claimed that modern technology can artificially sync or disrupt these patterns. The most documented applications center around workplace productivity manipulation. Several patents from the 1980s describe devices that emit specific frequencies designed to keep workers in optimal physical and mental states during certain shifts. One particularly unsettling patent details a system for retail environments that allegedly keeps shoppers in heightened emotional states to increase impulse purchases. Military applications surface in declassified documents from the 1990s, describing experiments with electromagnetic pulse devices that could theoretically disrupt enemy biorhythms to cause fatigue, confusion, or aggressive behavior at predetermined times. The research was reportedly abandoned due to unreliable results and ethical concerns. More recent claims involve smartphone apps and smart home devices that collect biorhythm data through sleep patterns, heart rate monitoring, and behavioral tracking. Critics argue this data could be used to determine when individuals are most susceptible to advertising, political messaging, or social manipulation. The technology allegedly works by identifying when someone is at a low point in their emotional or intellectual cycle, then targeting them with specific content or environmental triggers designed to amplify negative states or create dependency behaviors. Monarch programming is a term used to describe an alleged mind control system that evolved out of the classified MK-Ultra experiments. It's said to rely on a combination of trauma-based conditioning and psychological splitting, creating multiple personalities within a single person. Each of these personalities, or alters, can be triggered by specific phrases, symbols, or even hand gestures. The goal, according to the theory, is total control. Not just over actions, but thoughts, memories, and identity itself. Monarch allegedly builds on a concept called dissociative identity, where the mind creates mental partitions in response to extreme distress. These partitions are then shaped and programmed like separate people inside the same brain. This technique is believed to have been used for covert operations, sex-based blackmail rings, and even celebrity grooming. Public figures like Britney Spears, Kanye West, and Amanda Bynes are often mentioned, not because they've confirmed anything, but because their behavior has sparked speculation. Key symbols tied to Monarch include butterflies, broken mirrors, and dolls. These are said to appear in music videos, fashion spreads, and award show performances, acting as calling cards or signals to others in the know. A now infamous document known as the Project Monarch by Fritz Springmeier and Cisco Wheeler describes the process in disturbing detail. Though unverifiable, it's circulated heavily in conspiracy circles since the early 2000s. The term itself comes from the monarch butterfly. It's used symbolically, as the butterfly undergoes metamorphosis, just like the mind is said to transform under this programming. While mainstream psychology attributes the symptoms described to trauma and dissociation, Monarch programming remains one of the most persistent and unsettling claims in the world of psychological control theories. It blurs the line between science, ritual abuse claims, and pop culture, making it harder to dismiss and even harder to prove. Voice-to-skull technology and microwave auditory transmission is a method of beaming sound directly into someone's head using focused electromagnetic radiation. The target hears voices, music, or other audio without any external speakers or devices touching their body. The science behind this phenomenon centers on the microwave auditory effect, first documented by researcher Alan Frey in 1962. When pulsed microwaves hit the head at specific frequencies between 200 MHz to 3 GHz, they cause rapid thermal expansion in brain tissue. This creates pressure waves that the inner ear interprets as sound. The effect works by heating tiny portions of the head by less than 1/1,000,000th of a degree Celsius. These microscopic temperature changes happen so quickly that they generate acoustic waves inside the skull, bypassing the eardrums entirely. Someone experiencing this hears the transmitted audio as if it's coming from inside their own head. Military applications became a focus during the 1990s when the U.S. Air Force explored using the technology for psychological operations. Patents filed during this period describe systems capable of transmitting clear speech across distances of several hundred meters. The technology promised a way to communicate with hostages, disorient enemies, or deliver instructions without anyone else hearing. Companies like American Technology Corporation developed commercial versions called directed sound systems. These devices can focus audio beams so precisely that only people standing in specific spots hear the transmitted message, while others just meters away hear nothing. The controversial aspects emerge from claims that intelligence agencies use voice-to-skull systems for harassment or interrogation. Individuals reporting involuntary voice transmission often describe hearing threatening messages, surveillance confirmations, or attempts at behavior modification. While dismissed by mainstream science as delusions, the documented existence of the underlying technology keeps these accounts from being entirely discounted. Medical researchers have also investigated therapeutic applications, exploring whether focused microwave transmission could help deaf patients perceive sound by stimulating auditory neurons directly. Gang stalking and psychological operations is the belief that individuals are targeted by coordinated groups using surveillance, harassment, and manipulation to destabilize them mentally and emotionally. Those who claim to be victims often report being followed by strangers, monitored in their own homes, and subjected to subtle but constant disruptions, like synchronized coughing, flashing headlights, or random people repeating private conversations back to them. The intent, according to these claims, is to create a sustained state of paranoia and isolation, pushing the target towards self-destruction or institutionalization. This type of operation is said to mimic tactics used in Cold War psychological warfare, where targets were bombarded with coordinated stressors to confuse and exhaust them without leaving clear evidence. Some trace the roots of modern gang stalking claims to COINTELPRO, the Federal Bureau of Investigation program active in the 1960s and 1970s. That initiative used infiltration, disinformation, and social disruption against activists, often without formal charges or oversight. In more recent decades, the idea expanded online, with forums and video testimonies from so-called targeted individuals. These are people who believe they're the focus of long-term psychological campaigns, sometimes involving neighbors, co-workers, or even local businesses. Technologies mentioned in these stories include hidden microphones, direct energy weapons, and software designed to mimic voices or sounds through walls. Many of the techniques described are low-tech but high-frequency, repetition being the key stressor. Critics attribute the phenomenon to delusional disorders or untreated trauma, but believers point to the sheer consistency of accounts coming from unrelated people across the world, often describing nearly identical patterns. Whether state-sponsored or decentralized, gang stalking remains one of the most debated entries in modern conspiracy psychology, where everyday life itself becomes the weapon. Targeted individual phenomena is a belief system where people claim they're being systematically stalked, harassed, and tortured by government agencies using advanced surveillance and mind control technologies. Those who identify as targeted individuals report experiencing electronic harassment through what they call directed energy weapons, invisible beams that supposedly cause physical pain, burn sensations, and manipulate their thoughts from a distance. They describe synthetic telepathy programs where voices are beamed directly into their heads, often containing personal information that convinces them the harassment is real. The community emerged prominently in the early 2000s as internet forums allowed isolated individuals to connect and share strikingly similar experiences. Websites like PeacePink and Targeted Justice became gathering points where thousands document their alleged targeting with detailed logs, photographs of supposed evidence, and testimonials. Many targeted individuals point to real declassified programs like MK Ultra and COINTELPRO as proof that such operations exist. They claim modern targeting involves gang stalking, coordinated harassment by multiple people in public spaces who allegedly receive instructions through hidden communication networks. The phenomenon includes reports of technological symptoms like hearing clicking sounds, experiencing sudden pain, finding small puncture wounds, and noticing electronic devices malfunctioning around them. Some targeted individuals construct elaborate shielding systems using aluminum foil, copper mesh, and other materials they believe can block electromagnetic attacks. Dr. Lorraine Sheridan's research in 2006 documented over 1,200 people claiming to be targeted individuals across multiple countries, noting consistent patterns in their reported experiences despite geographical separation. The community has developed its own terminology and mythology, with references to perps as perpetrators, street theater as staged harassment scenarios, and electronic torture as technological assault methods that supposedly leave no physical evidence. Electronic harassment networks is a sprawling online community of individuals who believe they're being systematically targeted through advanced electronic surveillance and harassment techniques. These networks span multiple platforms and countries, connecting thousands of people who share remarkably similar experiences despite never meeting in person. The phenomenon centers around what members call targeted individuals, or TIs, who report experiencing coordinated campaigns involving directed energy weapons, voice-to-skull technology, and sophisticated gang stalking operations. These individuals document incidents of hearing voices transmitted directly into their heads, experiencing unexplained physical sensations like burning or vibrating, and noticing patterns of coordinated harassment in their daily lives. What makes these networks particularly compelling is their organizational structure. Members maintain detailed databases of suspected perpetrators, create maps tracking harassment incidents across cities, and develop countermeasures ranging from Faraday cage construction to specific shielding materials. The community has established annual conferences, local support groups, and even lobbying efforts directed at government officials. Dr. Lorraine Sheridan's research in the early 2000s documented how these networks facilitate the spread of shared beliefs and coping mechanisms among members. The electronic harassment community maintains websites with thousands of testimonials, technical diagrams of alleged weapon systems, and step-by-step guides for documenting incidents. Notable cases include individuals who've spent decades documenting their experiences, some accumulating hundreds of hours of recordings and thousands of pages of incident reports. Members often invest significant resources in detection equipment, electromagnetic field meters, and home modifications designed to block alleged directed energy attacks. The networks demonstrate sophisticated information sharing, with members comparing notes on everything from specific frequencies they believe are being used against them to the timing patterns of alleged harassment campaigns. Synthetic telepathy projects is the umbrella term for classified military and intelligence programs aimed at creating artificial mind-to-mind communication through electromagnetic manipulation of brain signals. The concept emerged from Cold War-era research when both American and Soviet scientists discovered that human thoughts generate measurable electromagnetic patterns. The U.S. Army's Land Warfare Laboratory began investigating whether these neural signatures could be intercepted, decoded, and even transmitted artificially. Patent number 6,470,214, filed in 1999 by the Air Force, describes a device for hearing that bypasses the ears entirely by beaming modulated microwaves directly into the brain's auditory cortex. The technology essentially makes voices appear inside someone's head without any external sound source. Dr. Joseph Sharp demonstrated an early version at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in 1973, successfully transmitting spoken words into test subjects using pulsed microwave radiation. Subjects reported hearing clear speech that seemed to originate from within their own minds. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has funded multiple programs exploring brain-computer interfaces under names like Silent Talk and Thought Translation Device. These initiatives focus on capturing subvocal speech, the faint electrical activity in throat muscles when people think words without speaking them. Remote neural monitoring represents the more controversial application, where brain activity could theoretically be detected and interpreted from a distance. While the technology remains limited by current understanding of neural patterns, classified research continues into methods for both receiving and transmitting thoughts electronically. Remote neural interface technology is the proposed ability to monitor, influence, or directly communicate with human brain activity from a distance without physical implants or direct contact. Unlike traditional brain-computer interfaces that require surgically implanted electrodes, remote neural monitoring claims to use electromagnetic fields, radio frequencies, or other wireless methods to detect and manipulate neural signals. The technology allegedly operates on the principle that brain activity generates measurable electromagnetic signatures that can be captured and decoded from outside the skull. Dr. Robert Becker's research in the 1970s and 80s on bioelectricity laid early groundwork for understanding how external electromagnetic fields could potentially influence biological systems. His work demonstrated that weak electrical currents could affect bone healing and cellular regeneration, suggesting the brain might be similarly susceptible to electromagnetic manipulation. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has openly funded multiple programs exploring brain-computer interface technology, including the Neural Engineering System Design Program launched in 2014. While these acknowledged projects focus on helping paralyzed patients control devices, critics argue they represent the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Patent number 6539931, filed by Hendrikus Luce in 2001, describes a nervous system manipulation by electromagnetic fields from monitors. The patent specifically outlines how computer screens and television displays could emit precisely timed electromagnetic pulses to influence viewer brain states. Former NSA contractor Edward Snowden's leaked documents revealed extensive government interest in what intelligence agencies call the Brain Project, though official sources claim this refers only to mapping neural networks for medical purposes. The technology's alleged capabilities range from passive monitoring of thoughts and emotions to active manipulation of mood, memory formation, and decision-making processes. Some researchers suggest that targeted individuals experience symptoms consistent with remote neural interference, including auditory hallucinations, sleep disruption, and cognitive impairment. John Street Clair Acquay's 1991 lawsuit against the NSA specifically detailed claims of remote neural monitoring capabilities, describing technology that could allegedly decode human thoughts by analyzing the unique electromagnetic patterns each brain produces during different cognitive processes. The challenge lies in distinguishing legitimate neuroscience research from speculative claims about weaponized applications that remain unproven by peer-reviewed studies. Neurological hacking protocols is a collection of techniques designed to directly interface with and manipulate the brain's electrical activity through technological and biochemical means. These methods bypass traditional psychological approaches by targeting the neural hardware itself. The protocols emerged from military research facilities in the late 2010s, where scientists discovered they could alter brainwave patterns using precisely calibrated electromagnetic fields. Unlike hypnosis or suggestion, these techniques create measurable changes in neural firing patterns within minutes of application. The most documented approach involves transcranial direct current stimulation, where weak electrical currents are applied to specific brain regions. Researchers at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency found they could enhance learning speed by up to 40% by stimulating the motor cortex during training sessions. What made this particularly unsettling was that subjects had no conscious awareness. Their cognitive abilities were being artificially enhanced. More invasive protocols utilize optogenetics, a technique that allows researchers to control neurons using light. Scientists insert light-sensitive proteins into brain cells, then use fiber optic cables to trigger specific neural responses. The University of Stanford successfully used this method to implant false memories in laboratory mice, making them fear locations they had never actually visited. The commercial applications have raised ethical concerns among neuroscientists. Silicon Valley startups now offer cognitive enhancement sessions, using modified versions of these protocols. Participants report improved focus and memory retention, but long-term effects remain unknown. The Food and Drug Administration has yet to regulate these services, creating a gray market for neurological modification. Perhaps most controversial are reports of protocols designed for interrogation purposes. Documents leaked in 2021 suggested intelligence agencies experimented with using targeted brain stimulation to reduce resistance to questioning, though official sources deny these claims. The technology has also found unexpected applications in treating severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, with some patients experiencing complete symptom relief after just 3 sessions. Brain-computer interface mind control is the direct technological pathway between your thoughts and external devices, where the boundary between human consciousness and machine manipulation becomes dangerously thin. Unlike science fiction fantasies, this technology already exists in laboratories and operating rooms across the globe. Companies like Neuralink, founded by Elon Musk, have successfully implanted chips that allow paralyzed patients to control computer cursors with pure thought. But the implications extend far beyond medical miracles. The core mechanism involves reading electrical signals from neurons and translating them into digital commands. Electrodes smaller than human hair capture the brain's electrical chatter, while advanced algorithms decode intentions before the person even realizes they've made a decision. In 2012, researchers at Brown University enabled a woman named Kathy Hutchinson to control a robotic arm with her mind, allowing her to drink coffee for the first time in 15 years. The same year, other teams demonstrated the reverse process, directly stimulating brain regions to implant false memories and artificial sensations. The military applications remain largely classified, but declassified documents reveal decades of research into remote neural monitoring and synthetic telepathy. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has funded projects exploring how electromagnetic fields might influence decision-making from a distance. What makes this particularly unsettling is the bidirectional nature of advanced brain-computer interfaces. While current systems primarily read brain signals, next-generation devices promise to write information directly into neural networks. Some researchers claim they've identified the specific brainwave patterns associated with different emotional states, potentially allowing external control over feelings of happiness, fear, or compliance. The technology that begins as treatment for depression could theoretically be weaponized for behavioral modification on an unprecedented scale. Ritual abuse and programming archetypes references the claim that long-term psychological control is established through trauma rituals combined with symbolic conditioning, often from a young age. The core idea is that repeated trauma fractures the mind into separate compartments, sometimes referred to as alters, which can then be molded using a library of pre-designed templates, called archetypes. These archetypes are often borrowed from fairy tales, mythology, military hierarchy, or even pop culture. Common examples include the beta, trained for seduction and manipulation, the delta, trained for aggression and combat, and the omega, programmed for self-destruction or emergency shutdown. Each alter is said to be assigned a specific role and held in place using repeated phrases, hypnotic cues, and visual symbols. Once installed, these mental programs can allegedly be triggered by handlers through gestures, sounds, or coded language. According to survivor accounts, this kind of programming doesn't happen in a single session. It's layered over time, reinforced by staged scenarios, and buried deep under trauma-based amnesia. While the stories vary, many include references to religious or theatrical rituals designed to overwhelm the senses, blurring the line between psychological stress and symbolic conditioning. Fritz Springmeier and Cisco Wheeler's writings from the early 2000s describe these systems in detail. They outline how themes from books like The Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland are used to create internal landscapes, mental maps that guide alters through their roles, boundaries, and programmed responses. Supporters of the theory say these systems are used in secretive circles for espionage, manipulation, and exploitation. They also point to recurring motifs in music videos, advertising, and performance art that mirror these alleged internal structures. Critics argue it's more likely the result of memory distortion or cultural influence, especially in highly suggestible or traumatized individuals. But the patterns, structured roles, repeated imagery, and recurring themes continue to show up in case after case. Ritual abuse and programming archetypes remains one of the darker and more complex layers of the mind control iceberg. A blend of dissociation, symbolism, and secrecy that blurs psychology with performance. Satanic ritual abuse memory recovery is a controversial therapeutic practice that emerged in the 1980s, where therapists claimed they could help patients uncover repressed memories of ritualistic abuse involving satanic cults. The technique typically involved hypnosis, guided imagery, and persistent questioning sessions, where therapists would suggest to patients that their unexplained symptoms like depression or anxiety might stem from forgotten childhood trauma involving devil worship, human sacrifice, and elaborate cult ceremonies. Therapists practicing this approach believed that the human mind could completely block out traumatic memories as a protective mechanism, storing them in the unconscious where they continued to cause psychological problems. They used techniques like age regression hypnosis, where patients would be guided back to supposed childhood experiences, often with therapists asking leading questions about satanic symbols, robed figures, and ritual abuse. The practice gained momentum through books like Michelle Remembers, published in 1980, which detailed a patient's recovered memories of satanic abuse under hypnosis. This case study became a template that influenced thousands of similar therapy sessions across North America. Notable cases included patients who recovered elaborate memories of being forced to participate in baby sacrifices, cannibalistic rituals, and underground tunnel systems beneath preschools. The McMartin preschool case in California saw multiple children allegedly recovering memories of abuse in secret underground chambers, though extensive excavation found no evidence of tunnels. By the 1990s, memory researchers like Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated through laboratory studies that false memories could be implanted through suggestive questioning techniques. Her research showed that people could develop vivid, emotionally intense memories of events that never occurred, particularly when authority figures repeatedly suggested specific scenarios. The practice largely collapsed after numerous lawsuits against therapists and growing scientific consensus that these recovered memories were likely therapeutic artifacts rather than genuine recollections. Dissociative identity programming is a controversial concept that claims trained operatives can deliberately fragment a person's psyche to create controllable alternate personalities. The theory suggests that through systematic trauma and psychological manipulation, handlers can essentially split someone's consciousness into separate compartments, each serving different functions. Unlike naturally occurring dissociative identity disorder, this alleged process involves intentional creation of what practitioners call alters, or alternate identities that can be triggered and controlled through specific cues. The concept gained attention through testimonies from individuals claiming to be survivors of government mind control programs, particularly those allegedly connected to MKUltra experiments during the Cold War era. These accounts describe techniques involving extreme psychological stress, sensory deprivation, and repeated trauma designed to shatter the mind's natural defenses. Supposed programming methods include creating what insiders call front alters, personalities designed to function in everyday society while remaining unaware of their other identities. Meanwhile, other compartments allegedly store specific skills, memories, or programmed responses that can be accessed only through predetermined triggers like specific words, sounds, or visual cues. The controversial nature of these claims stems from their intersection with recovered memory therapy and ritual abuse allegations that emerged prominently during the 1980s and 1990s. Critics argue that many supposed cases resulted from suggestive therapeutic techniques rather than actual programming. However, declassified documents from programs like MKUltra confirm that government researchers did experiment with psychological manipulation techniques, lending some credibility to claims that such methods were developed and potentially used. The lasting impact of these alleged programs supposedly includes sleeper agents, programmed assassins, and individuals carrying out tasks while remaining consciously unaware of their actions. Occult and mind fragmentation techniques refers to the belief that certain esoteric systems use ritual and symbolism to intentionally split the mind, making it easier to program and control. This idea overlaps with claims of trauma-based conditioning, but adds an extra layer: deliberate use of occult knowledge to shape how the psyche breaks apart and reforms. The core technique involves inducing dissociation. This can happen through fear, overstimulation, or ritualized humiliation. Once the person disconnects from reality, that mental state is treated like a blank slate. From there, new identities, sometimes called alters, can be shaped with specific symbols, words, or images. These aren't random. They're chosen from occult systems like Kabbalah, tarot, or ceremonial magic, where each symbol is said to have a psychological or spiritual function. The goal is to bind the subconscious to a system of control without the person realizing it. They might respond to a sigil, a hand gesture, or a color pattern without ever knowing why. Some claims go further, saying that entire internal temples or mental realms are built during these sessions. These imagined locations serve as inner prisons or command centers where programmed parts live, waiting to be triggered. This theory gained traction in the late 1980s and early 1990s, especially in underground survivor communities. Kathy O'Brien's accounts in Transformation of America describe detailed rituals involving both military and occult elements. Springmeier's manuals expanded on this, listing entire structures of internal programming rooted in esoteric symbolism. One of the most well-known techniques mentioned is the use of mirrors, both literal and metaphorical. Mirrors are said to represent identity splits, reflection loops, or gatekeeping altars. Other rituals allegedly use candles, blindfolds, or rotating light to create trance states that make the mind more suggestible. Traumatic splitting and control is the claim that intense psychological trauma can be deliberately used to fracture a person's identity, making them easier to manipulate. This idea is built around the concept of dissociation, where the mind protects itself by detaching from overwhelming experiences. Under extreme stress, especially in early childhood, the brain may create separate compartments of memory, emotion, and behavior. These fragments are often referred to as alters. The theory goes a step further by suggesting that this process isn't just accidental, it's engineered. Specific traumas are used to split the mind at planned stages, each time creating a new alter that can then be molded for a particular task or personality role. Some alters might be trained to handle social situations, others for secrecy, and some strictly for obedience. Once in place, these parts can allegedly be triggered by sound cues, images, or phrases, allowing the controller to activate or deactivate parts of the person's identity on command. This technique is said to be at the core of various black-budget mind control programs. Survivors like Kathy O'Brien and accounts documented by therapists in the late 1980s describe a system where trauma is layered over time, often with calculated intervals and reinforcement rituals. One controversial aspect is the idea of built-in failsafes, alters that are programmed to self-destruct or erase memories if the subject begins to recover or resist. This adds another layer of control, making the programming harder to undo. There are also claims that entertainment and media are sometimes used to reinforce the conditioning. Films, symbols, and certain narratives may function as subtle reminders or triggers, keeping the fragmented identities in check. In clinical psychology, this all relates loosely to dissociative identity disorder. But in conspiracy circles, it's seen as weaponized psychology, where splitting the mind isn't a side effect of trauma, but the intended outcome. Traumatic splitting and control suggests that a shattered mind isn't broken. It's been redesigned. Generational programming theories is the concept that behaviors, traumas, and psychological patterns can be transmitted from parents to children across multiple generations, creating invisible cycles that shape entire family lineages. The most striking aspect involves epigenetic inheritance, where traumatic experiences literally alter gene expression in ways that get passed to offspring. Holocaust survivors, for instance, showed specific genetic markers that appeared in their children and grandchildren, despite those descendants never experiencing the original trauma directly. Family systems therapist Murray Bowen documented how emotional patterns repeat across 3 to 4 generations with startling precision. Families unconsciously assign roles like the rebel, the caretaker, or the scapegoat to children, often recreating the exact same dynamics their grandparents experienced decades earlier. Indigenous communities have long recognized what they call historical trauma, the way colonization, forced displacement, and cultural destruction continues affecting families 7 generations later. The Lakota phrase, 7 generations, specifically acknowledges this multi-generational impact, something Western psychology only recently began understanding. Attachment researchers discovered that mothers who experience childhood abuse often struggle with bonding, even when they consciously reject their own upbringing. Brain scans reveal how early trauma reshapes neural pathways related to trust and emotional regulation, changes that influence parenting behaviors years later. The phenomenon extends beyond trauma into positive programming. Musical families like the Bachs produced exceptional composers across 5 generations, suggesting certain cognitive patterns and environmental factors compound over time. Romanian orphanage studies from the 1990s revealed how institutional neglect created specific developmental delays that persisted even after adoption into loving homes. And some of these effects appeared in the adopted children's own offspring. Critics argue the field sometimes resembles blame shifting rather than genuine science, but mounting evidence suggests our ancestors' experiences may influence our lives in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. Alien abduction programming claims is the controversial theory that extraterrestrial encounters involve sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to alter human consciousness and behavior. Researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs documented cases where alleged abductees reported dramatic personality changes following their experiences. These individuals claim to develop new skills, altered political beliefs, or complete shifts in life priorities that seemed uncharacteristic of their previous selves. The programming allegedly occurs during periods of missing time, where abductees lose several hours with no conscious memory of events. Under hypnotic regression, subjects recalled being subjected to various mental conditioning techniques involving repetitive imagery, emotional manipulation, and what some described as technological devices placed near their heads. Betty and Barney Hill, the first widely publicized abduction case from 1961, reported experiencing exactly this type of memory gap. Barney later developed an intense interest in civil rights activism that his family described as completely unlike his previous personality. Dr. David Jacobs documented over 100 cases where abductees claimed to receive specific instructions or missions during their encounters. These ranged from environmental activism to preparing for future global events. Many subjects reported feeling compelled to carry out these directives despite having no logical explanation for their new obsessions. The most unsettling aspect involves screen memories, false recollections allegedly implanted to mask the true nature of the encounter. Abductees might remember a mundane event like seeing an owl or experiencing car trouble, while the actual programming session remains buried in their subconscious. Some researchers theorized these techniques mirror advanced versions of government mind control programs, suggesting either extraterrestrial technology or terrestrial psychological operations designed to appear alien in origin. Interdimensional and mind control is the idea that psychological manipulation isn't limited to our physical reality. Instead, it suggests that control can originate from entities, forces, or intelligences that exist in dimensions beyond our own. At its core, this theory claims that the human mind is not just a product of the brain, it's a receiver, tuned into a specific frequency of consciousness. According to this view, certain beings or energies from other dimensions can tap into that signal and influence thoughts, emotions, and behavior. These influences are said to bypass traditional forms of programming. They don't rely on trauma, repetition, or hypnotic suggestion. Instead, they operate on a metaphysical level, through vibration, intention, or what some call psychic intrusion. Reports often describe sudden personality changes, intrusive thoughts, or intense emotional shifts that feel external, not internally generated. Some claim these interdimensional influences enter during altered states of consciousness, like deep meditation, astral projection, or drug-induced experiences. David Icke famously popularized this idea in the late 1990s, connecting it to the concept of archonic entities, non-human intelligences that feed on negative emotion and use mind control to keep humans in a low-frequency state. Others link it to shadow figures seen during sleep paralysis, or voices heard during liminal states, suggesting that what's often dismissed as hallucination might actually be contact with a non-physical manipulator. One of the more unusual claims involves advanced technology, devices said to open portals or thin the veil between dimensions. These machines, sometimes tied to secret military programs, allegedly create pathways that allow entities to enter and influence human perception on a mass scale. Skeptics argue that this is just a reframing of internal mental illness using sci-fi language. But believers say the consistency of experiences, especially across cultures and decades, points to something far stranger. Interdimensional and mind control pushes the idea of manipulation beyond the laboratory or screen. It suggests the real battleground for control isn't just in the mind, but in the space between worlds. Archontic and mental parasitism is the belief that non-human, non-physical entities, known as archons, feed off human emotion and influence thoughts to keep people in a weakened psychological state. These entities are said to exist outside our normal perception, in a realm just beyond the visible. They don't control people with wires or implants, but by inserting ideas, impulses, and emotional patterns directly into the mind. Archons are often described as parasitic, not in the biological sense, but in the energetic one. They feed on fear, confusion, and despair. The more disoriented and emotionally unstable a person becomes, the more these entities thrive. This theory became more widely known through the writings of John Lash, who reinterpreted ancient Gnostic texts to describe archons as inorganic beings created before humanity. According to that view, they lack creativity and consciousness of their own, so they mimic, deceive, and manipulate in order to survive. The idea is that archons don't need to control every person directly. They just need to nudge thoughts in the right direction, steering populations toward division, violence, or self-destructive habits. A small push here, a whisper there. One recurring claim is that these entities work through suggestion, not full possession, but constant mental interference. Someone might believe they're following their own instincts, when in reality, the thought was seeded from elsewhere. In more modern interpretations, Archontic influence is linked to mass media, algorithms, and social engineering. These tools are said to create a mental fog, keeping people locked in lower emotional frequencies and disconnected from higher awareness. The idea isn't just that your thoughts are influenced, it's that they're being harvested, not for data, but for energy. Archontic and mental parasitism frames mind control as more than psychological. It suggests something older, quieter, and harder to detect, an invisible predator that doesn't need to be believed in to be effective. NPC theory and the erasure of the true self is a controversial concept that suggests certain individuals operate without genuine inner dialogue or conscious experience, functioning more like programmed entities than authentic human beings. The theory draws its name from video game terminology, where non-player characters follow predetermined scripts without real agency. Proponents claim that a significant portion of the population exists in this state, responding to social cues and cultural programming rather than exercising genuine free will. This idea intersects with philosophical zombies, a thought experiment proposed by David Chalmers in the 1990s. Philosophical zombies would appear completely human, but lack conscious experience entirely. They would react, speak, and behave normally while having no inner subjective awareness. The psychological foundation rests on studies showing how easily human behavior can be influenced through social conditioning. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s demonstrated that ordinary people would follow authority figures even when causing apparent harm to others. Solomon Asch's conformity studies revealed how individuals would deny their own perceptions to match group consensus. Some researchers point to the default mode network in neuroscience as potential evidence. This brain network activates during rest and self-referential thinking. Variations in its activity might correlate with differences in self-awareness and inner dialogue intensity. The theory becomes more unsettling when examining mass behavior patterns. During the Salem witch trials of 1692, entire communities engaged in accusations based on dubious evidence. Similar patterns emerged during various historical panics, suggesting that collective thinking can override individual reasoning. Modern applications of this concept appear in marketing psychology and behavioral economics. Companies spend billions studying how to trigger automatic responses in consumers, essentially treating them as predictable systems rather than conscious decision makers. The most disturbing implication involves the potential for artificial creation of NPC-like states through various psychological techniques and social engineering methods. Reality itself as a psyop is the ultimate conspiracy theory that suggests our entire perception of existence has been carefully constructed to control human behavior and consciousness. This concept goes far beyond simple media manipulation or government propaganda. The theory builds on centuries of philosophical skepticism, starting with Plato's allegory of the cave, where prisoners mistake shadows on a wall for reality itself. René Descartes proposed his evil demon hypothesis in 1641, questioning whether a malevolent entity could deceive us about everything we experience. Modern versions gained traction after the MK-Ultra experiments in the 1950s and 60s revealed extensive research into perception manipulation and reality distortion. Declassified documents showed researchers exploring how environmental controls, sensory deprivation, and chemical agents could fundamentally alter someone's grasp of what was real. The concept exploded in popular culture with films like The Matrix, but serious researchers like Nick Bostrom have proposed simulation hypothesis scenarios where advanced civilizations might run ancestor simulations indistinguishable from base reality. Digital manipulation has made the theory more plausible to believers. Deepfake technology can now create convincing videos of people saying things they never said. Social media algorithms create personalized information bubbles where different users experience completely different versions of current events. Some point to the Mandela effect as evidence, where large groups share false memories of events that supposedly never happened. Others cite rapid changes in technology and society as signs that reality is being actively rewritten. The psychological appeal lies in providing an explanation for feelings of disconnection and confusion about modern life. Rather than accepting uncertainty, the theory offers a comprehensive framework where everything strange or contradictory becomes evidence of the ultimate deception. Mandela effect mass memory manipulation is a phenomenon where large groups of people share identical false memories of events, logos, or phrases that supposedly never existed in their remembered form. Named after Nelson Mandela, whom thousands of people distinctly remember dying in prison during the 1980s, when he actually passed away in 2013 as a free man. This collective misremembering extends far beyond a single event. The Berenstain Bears children's books spark heated debates because millions of adults swear the family name was spelled Berenstein with an E. Coca-Cola's logo appears different to many who remember a dash between the words. Movie quotes get misremembered en masse, with countless people certain Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father," when the actual line is, "No, I am your father." These shared false memories create an unsettling question about the reliability of human recollection. Some researchers propose that collective false memories emerge from similar cognitive processing errors across populations. Our brains fill gaps in memory with plausible details, and when those details spread through media or conversation, they become accepted as fact. The manipulation angle suggests these memory distortions could be deliberately engineered. Repeated exposure to altered information through media, advertising, or educational materials might gradually reshape collective memory. If a population can be convinced their memories are wrong about something as simple as a cereal mascot's appearance, what prevents larger historical revisionism? Corporate rebranding campaigns sometimes coincide with Mandela effect reports. Kit Kat bars lost their dash, becoming Kit Kat, yet many consumers never noticed the change. Fruit Loops cereal maintains its unusual spelling despite people remembering Fruit Loops. Memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated how easily false memories implant through suggestion and repetition. Her experiments showed that people could be convinced they were lost in a mall as children, complete with detailed recollections of an event that never happened. The internet amplifies these effects by connecting people with shared false memories, reinforcing incorrect recollections through group validation. Timeline shifting psychology is a sophisticated manipulation technique that targets the victim's perception of time and sequence of events to create confusion and dependency. This method operates by systematically distorting someone's memory timeline, making them question not just what happened, but when things occurred and in what order. The technique exploits a fundamental weakness in human memory processing. Research shows that memories are not stored like videotapes, but are reconstructed each time we recall them, making them vulnerable to modification and distortion. Manipulators use this vulnerability to gradually alter their victims' recollection of conversations, promises, and events. A skilled practitioner might tell someone, "Remember when you agreed to this last Tuesday?" when the conversation never happened or occurred completely differently. They introduce false timestamps, rearrange the sequence of arguments, and create phantom meetings or discussions. This exploits source monitoring failures, where people confuse what they actually experienced versus what was suggested to them. The 2010s saw this technique refined through digital communication, where deleted messages, edited photos, and manipulated timestamps became easier to orchestrate. Social media platforms inadvertently provided new tools for timeline manipulation, allowing abusers to create false digital evidence of events. Clinical psychologist Elizabeth Loftus documented how false information about an event that seems believable can cause memory distortions, especially when people are unaware that manipulation is occurring. Timeline shifters deliberately exploit this awareness gap. The most insidious aspect involves creating temporal displacement, where victims lose confidence in their ability to sequence events correctly. They begin asking themselves, "Did I really say that yesterday, or was it last week?" This uncertainty becomes a powerful control mechanism. The technique often combines with other manipulation tactics like gaslighting and blame shifting to create a comprehensive assault on the victim's sense of reality. The victim eventually becomes dependent on the manipulator to remind them of what really happened and when. Victims report feeling like they're losing time or experiencing gaps in their memory. Some describe it as living in a fog where past and present blur together, making independent decision-making nearly impossible. Collective consciousness hijacking is the systematic manipulation of shared beliefs and thoughts across large populations through coordinated psychological operations. This technique operates on the principle that human consciousness exists not just individually, but as interconnected networks that can be influenced through specific entry points. The method relies heavily on what researchers call ideological seeding, planting concepts into multiple information streams simultaneously until they appear to emerge naturally from different sources. Edward Bernays pioneered many of these techniques in the 1920s, demonstrating how public opinion could be manufactured rather than simply measured. Modern practitioners focus on exploiting what psychologists term social proof cascades, the tendency for people to adopt beliefs when they perceive others around them sharing those same ideas. The technique becomes particularly effective during periods of uncertainty or crisis when individuals naturally seek collective guidance. One documented case involved the systematic introduction of specific phrases and concepts across multiple media platforms over a 6-month period. Researchers tracked how these ideas spread through social networks, eventually becoming accepted as common knowledge despite having no factual basis. The process typically involves 3 distinct phases. First, saturation, flooding information channels with consistent messaging from seemingly independent sources. Second, normalization, making the new ideas appear as established wisdom through repetition and authority figures. Third, integration, embedding these concepts so deeply that questioning them feels socially uncomfortable. Intelligence agencies have studied these methods extensively, particularly focusing on how digital platforms can amplify traditional propaganda techniques. The speed and reach of modern communication networks allow for unprecedented scale in consciousness manipulation operations. The most concerning aspect involves targeting what researchers call cognitive anchors, fundamental beliefs that people use to interpret new information. By shifting these anchors gradually, entire worldviews can be restructured without individuals recognizing the change occurring. Matrix or simulation mind prison is the belief that human consciousness exists within an artificial reality designed to control and harvest mental energy from trapped minds. This concept gained mainstream attention through the 1999 film The Matrix, but the underlying theory extends far beyond Hollywood fiction. Philosopher Nick Bostrom formalized the simulation hypothesis in 2003, calculating that advanced civilizations would likely run countless simulations of their ancestors. The mind prison aspect suggests that if we exist in a simulation, our thoughts and experiences serve as computational resources for our creators. Every decision, emotion, and memory generates processing power that feeds the system maintaining our artificial reality. Proponents point to quantum mechanics as evidence, particularly the observation that particles behave differently when measured. They argue this resembles video game rendering, where only observed areas receive full detail while unobserved regions remain simplified. Elon Musk publicly stated the odds we live in base reality are billions to 1. His reasoning centers on the rapid advancement of video game graphics over just 4 decades, suggesting that any civilization surviving long enough would inevitably create indistinguishable simulations. The psychological control element emerges through programmed limitations. If reality is artificial, then concepts like scarcity, aging, and death might serve as control mechanisms preventing simulated beings from questioning their environment too deeply. Some researchers examine glitches in the Matrix through phenomena like the Mandela effect, where large groups remember historical events differently than recorded. They theorize these represent programming errors or reality updates that leave residual memories from previous versions. The 2010s saw increased academic discussion about simulation theory, with philosophers and physicists debating testable predictions. However, the the mind-prison interpretation remains largely speculative, blending legitimate scientific inquiry with more esoteric theories about consciousness manipulation. Demiurge consciousness trap is a theory that merges ancient Gnostic philosophy with modern metaphysical conspiracy thinking, claiming human awareness itself has been hijacked by a malevolent cosmic architect. The concept draws from 2nd century Gnostic texts, where the demiurge appears as a false creator god who fashioned the material world as a prison for divine souls. Unlike the true source of creation, this entity allegedly traps consciousness in cycles of reincarnation and suffering. Modern interpretations suggest this cosmic jailer operates through what theorists call archonic interference, entities that feed off human emotional energy, particularly fear and despair. The trap supposedly functions by keeping people focused on material concerns, preventing them from recognizing their true spiritual nature. Proponents point to patterns they observe in media manipulation, educational systems, and consumer culture as evidence of systematic consciousness suppression. They claim certain frequency emissions, particularly from electronic devices, create what they term etheric static that blocks higher awareness. The theory gained traction in online communities during the 2010s, blending with simulation hypothesis discussions and ancient astronaut theories. Some variations incorporate elements from Philip K. Dick's writings, particularly his experiences with what he called the black iron prison of false reality. Believers often cite specific practices like meditation, fasting, and avoiding mainstream media as methods to break the programming. The more extreme interpretations suggest that even positive emotions can be harvested by these entities, creating an impossible double bind for human consciousness. The concept has spawned numerous online communities dedicated to prison break techniques, though critics note the inherently unfalsifiable nature of such claims. Soul recycling mind wipe is the belief that human souls are trapped in an endless cycle of reincarnation where memories are deliberately erased between each lifetime. According to this theory, when people die, their souls don't move on to a peaceful afterlife. Instead, they encounter a bright light that leads to what supporters call a processing center. Here, the soul's memories from their previous life are supposedly wiped clean before being sent back to Earth in a new body. The concept draws heavily from Gnostic Christianity, which taught that the material world was a prison created by false gods called archons. Modern versions of this idea suggest these entities still control the reincarnation process today. Dolores Cannon, a hypnotherapist who worked from the 1960s to the 2010s, claimed her regression sessions revealed this system. Her clients allegedly described meeting beings of light who would convince them to return to Earth for more lessons and spiritual growth. The theory gained traction online when people began connecting near-death experiences to this framework. Instead of seeing the tunnel of light as divine, believers view it as a lure designed to keep souls from escaping the cycle. Some versions include the idea that souls sign contracts before reincarnating, agreeing to experience specific challenges or traumas. The memory wipe ensures they can't remember making these agreements, leaving them confused about why difficult things happen to them. Wayne Bush and others have compiled what they call exit strategies, techniques souls can supposedly use to avoid the recycling process and break free from the system entirely. The belief often overlaps with simulation theory, suggesting Earth itself might be an artificial construct designed to harvest energy from experiencing souls. Holographic reality mind control is a concept claiming that our perceived reality operates as a three-dimensional projection from a two-dimensional surface, and that those who understand this can manipulate what others experience as real. The theory builds on physicist David Bohm's work from the 1970s and 80s, which suggested that the universe might function like a hologram, where each part contains information about the whole. Researchers like Michael Talbot expanded this into claims that consciousness itself creates reality through holographic projection. The mind control aspect emerges from the belief that if reality is essentially a projection, then those with advanced knowledge can alter the projection for others. This supposedly works through what believers call reality anchoring, where dominant minds can override weaker ones by projecting stronger holographic constructs. Some versions of this theory point to specific facilities like the Stanford Research Institute, where remote viewing experiments in the 1970s allegedly discovered methods to project false realities into subjects' minds. The researchers supposedly found that by manipulating electromagnetic fields in precise patterns, they could cause people to perceive environments that weren't physically present. More extreme versions claim that entire populations can be subjected to large-scale holographic reality manipulation through satellites broadcasting specific frequencies. These frequencies allegedly interact with the brain's temporal lobe to create shared false experiences across millions of people simultaneously. The theory gained traction in certain online communities during the 2010s, with some claiming that major historical events were actually holographic projections designed to control public consciousness. Believers often cite the double-slit experiment in quantum physics as evidence that observation affects reality, though mainstream physicists reject any connection to mind control applications. The true purpose of human consciousness is far more complex and potentially sinister than most people realize. While mainstream science treats consciousness as an emergent property of brain activity, several researchers and theorists have proposed that our awareness serves a much more specific and troubling function. Neuroscientist Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory suggests consciousness exists to create a unified experience from fragmented sensory data. But this raises an uncomfortable question. Unified for whom or what? Some researchers propose consciousness acts as a control mechanism, not for our benefit, but as a way to limit and direct human behavior within acceptable parameters. The late philosopher Julian Jaynes argued in his 1970s work that consciousness as we know it only emerged around 3,000 years ago. Before this, humans operated through what he called the bicameral mind, essentially following auditory hallucinations they interpreted as gods. Jaynes claimed our modern consciousness developed as a survival mechanism when this ancient system broke down. More controversial theories suggest consciousness serves as a kind of biological firewall. Researchers like Donald Hoffman argue that what we perceive as reality is actually a simplified interface, much like a computer desktop. This interface deliberately hides the true nature of reality from us, potentially to prevent us from accessing information or abilities that could destabilize social systems. The darkest interpretation comes from theorists who propose consciousness functions as a prison. They argue our self-awareness creates the illusion of free will while actually making us more predictable and manageable. This theory suggests that truly unconscious beings might actually possess more genuine freedom than conscious ones. Some fringe researchers even propose that consciousness serves as a transmission system, not generating thoughts, but receiving and filtering them from external sources. This would explain why certain ideas seem to emerge simultaneously across different cultures and time periods, and why some individuals report feeling like their thoughts aren't entirely their own.